The day King Kaelan signed the severance decree, it was raining. Not the gentle kind of rain that softens a morning and makes people feel like staying in bed. It was the kind of rain that hit the palace windows like an accusation, the kind that flooded the low roads and turned the courtyards into shallow mirrors of gray sky. It was the kind of rain that did not care who was watching it or what they felt about it. It simply came down, hard and without apology, the way certain truths arrive, all at once, indifferent to timing, not adjusting themselves for the convenience of the people they were falling on. The High Council chamber was a long room with high ceilings and walls lined with portraits of every Alpha King who had ruled the Northern Wolf Kingdom in the past 400 years. 17 faces in oil paint, 17 men who had governed by force, by instinct, by tradition so old it had been mistaken for nature. Not a single one of them had ever passed a law that made their own generals uneasy. Not a single one of them had ever needed to. Kaelan was about to become the first. He stood at the head of the long marble table, the decree laid flat in front of him on a sheet of pressed parchment. The ink was still wet at the top, the letters thick and deliberate, the kind of handwriting that belonged to a person who had been writing this particular document in his mind for 17 years before setting it to paper. The candles on either side of it bent slightly in the draft from the door, two small flames that had been burning for 3 hours through the deliberations, and looked as though they intended to keep burning regardless of what the men in the room decided to do. Kaelan had always found something useful in things that burned regardless. Lord Aldrich, his head of military affairs, was already on his feet before Kaelan had even reached for the pen. Aldrich was a broad man, 63 years old, who had built his physical presence the way some men build fortunes slowly over decades, until it was simply the condition of any room he entered. He had a general's voice, the kind trained for open fields and military formations, and he used it even in enclosed spaces because it was the only register he possessed. "This is not a law," Aldrich said. "This is a disruption, a destabilization of the very social structure that has kept our alliances intact for centuries. You are not signing a decree, Your Majesty. You are pulling the lowest stone from an arch and calling the collapse architecture." Kaelan did not look up. "Sit down, Aldrich. The noble houses have built their bloodlines on this system. The bonds ensure loyalty, ensure continuation of lineage, ensure the stable succession that has prevented civil conflict in this kingdom for 6 generations. You cannot simply sit down." Aldrich sat not because he wanted to. Because Kaelan's voice had gone to the specific register it went to when the conversation was already completed, and what remained was only the noise of the room catching up to that fact. Every man at that table who had known Kaelan for more than 6 months understood what that particular quiet meant. It was the quiet of a decision already made and sealed. It was the quiet of a man who had waited long enough and had stopped waiting. Lord Crest, who sat 3 seats down and had the politician's gift for waiting until the room's most dangerous current had passed before adding his own, raised one careful hand. He was a lean man, 48, with the kind of face that had learned to reveal very little, and had been practicing that lesson for 30 years. "Your Majesty." The decree as written strips all legal recognition from bonds formed without documented consent from both parties. That covers roughly 60% of existing noble bonds. You understand what that means for inheritance claims currently before the royal courts. There are families who have built their entire property structures around those chains, overturning them retroactively. "Creates the correct legal outcome," Kaelan said, still writing. "The children born of non-consensual bonds will be reclassified as freeborn. Their claims to inheritance will be evaluated on their own merit, on who they are, not on the legality of a bond their parents were forced into. I am aware that this inconveniences families who have been using their children as instruments of property transfer. That inconvenience is the correct response to a practice that should never have been legal." A ripple moved through the room, not the dramatic kind of movement, the kind that happens below the surface that you feel before you see, like the shift in a room's pressure before a storm. Lord Fenn pressed his hands flat on the table. He was 61, and he had the stillness of a man who had spent 4 decades choosing very carefully when to be heard and when to hold. His family had conducted 4 bond arrangements in the last decade, 2 of which had produced land transfers currently subject to active inheritance claims. He did not look at Kaelan when he spoke. "This will be challenged," he said. "Yes," Kaelan said. "By people I will then have cause to investigate." Fenn's hands went still against the marble, His face did not change. Lord Martin, the youngest member of the council at 26, sat very straight and said nothing. He had spent his first year on the council learning to read the room before contributing to it. He was reading the room now, and what he was reading suggested that silence was the correct contribution. Lord Aldrich tried once more. It was not his best quality, the inability to let a settled thing stay settled. Your Majesty, with all respect to your position, you are a wolf. You understand better than anyone in this room that the mate bond is not a human legal construction. It is biological, it runs in the blood, it is instinct as deep as the shift itself. You cannot legislate against something built into the species by forces older than any kingdom. Kalen set down the pen. He looked up. I know what the bond is, he said. The room changed quality. It was the same room, same walls, same 17 all-painted faces watching from above, same rain against the windows. But something underneath all of those things shifted in the way that shifts when a person who has been containing something very large and very still stops containing it. I know exactly what the bond is, Kalen said. I know what it does to the person inside one they never chose. I know what it takes from them. I know what it leaves behind. I have watched it happen and I have seen where it ends. I am not interested in being told that biology justifies what I have watched. Nature built the bond. Human beings built the system that weaponized it. These are not the same thing, and I will not treat them as the same thing in my law. The room was so quiet that the rain against the windows was suddenly present in a way it had not been before, as though the silence had made room for it. Kalen picked up the pen. He wrote his name at the bottom of the decree. It was not a ceremonial signature. It was the signature of a man completing an act that had always been going to be completed, that no amount of deliberation this evening had ever been capable of preventing. He set down the pen. He looked at the room. The severance decree is law, he said. Effective at dawn tomorrow. The council will draft the enforcement protocols by the end of the week. Any bond formed without documented bilateral consent from this point forward is a criminal act under the Crown's jurisdiction. The parties who arranged it will be prosecuted. The legal professionals who assisted without flagging the violation will face review. This is comprehensive and deliberate. He paused. I expect resistance from certain quarters, from certain financial interests, from certain people in this room. That resistance is anticipated and it will be managed. But I want everyone at this table to understand something clearly. The law is signed. This conversation is finished. What we are doing from this point forward is enforcement, not debate. He handed the rolled copy of the decree to his chief scribe, without looking away from the room. The session is closed, he said. You may go. They went, Aldrich last, after a moment at the door that was designed to communicate something, and communicated instead only that he understood he had lost, and had not yet found the correct response to that. Kalen did not move until the last footsteps had faded down the corridor. Then he turned to the window. The rain had not changed. The courtyard below was empty except for 2 guards standing at their post with their cloaks soaked through. Beyond the palace walls, the city spread out in gray and brown, and the occasional warm yellow of a window lit from inside. Lanterns in the market streets. Fires behind glass in houses where families were having ordinary evenings, unaware that something had just changed above them. His city. 200,000 people who would wake up tomorrow under a different law. Most of them would not feel the difference immediately. The law's effects would move through the courts slowly, through inheritance filings and social structures that took time to shift because they were built into how people thought, not only how they acted. The ones inside forced bonds would feel it, not the biological reality. The decree could not immediately touch that, but it created something that had not existed before, a space, a formal acknowledgement that this was wrong, a path where before there had been no path. He pressed 2 fingers against the cold glass. There had been a girl. There was always a story, and his began with a girl named Lena, who had been his cousin's age, a year younger than him, who had grown up visiting the eastern estates in summers because her family's property bordered his cousin's. She had been the kind of girl that every gathering remembered afterward, not because she was the loudest or the most beautiful or the most accomplished, but because she brought a quality of attention to everything she encountered, a genuine interest in the world, a brightness that was not performance. It was simply how she moved through things, and it made the things she moved through seem more interesting in response. She had been 19 when the bond was arranged. Kaelan had been 23, old enough to understand exactly what he was watching and exactly what he could and could not do about it within the legal structures that existed at the time. Lena had not been asked. Her family had been asked in the specific way that meant the answer was already decided, and the consultation was a formality designed to insulate the arranging party from legal challenge. The man she had been bonded to was Lord Harwick, 62 years old, in possession of land adjacent to Lena's family's holdings in the Eastern Territories, and the arrangement had been proposed and completed in under 6 weeks because Harwick's family had wanted the land and Lena's family had needed money, and the bond was the instrument through which both of those things could be achieved simultaneously, in a way that was, at the time, entirely legal. Kaelan had gone to his father. His father had explained to him carefully and without unkindness that some things were simply how things were, and that a young man's feelings about the matter were not among the available considerations. He had gone to Lena. She had been sitting by the window in the room where she was staying, looking out at the eastern grounds, and she had turned when he came in with the expression of a person who had already completed the process of understanding what was happening and had arrived at a place beyond the useful emotions in the territory of endurance. She had not been frightened. She had not been angry. She had simply been past those things. She had said, "I know you would change it if you could." He had said, "I will change it, not now, but I will." She had looked at him for a long moment, then she had said, "Be careful what you promise." She had died 2 years into the bond. The physicians recorded it as a fever. It had not been a fever. He had known what it was. The bond had not killed her directly. It had done it the way water does it to stone, slowly and consistently, and without any single dramatic moment, wearing away the places where resistance was possible until there was not enough left to hold. He had stood at her funeral with his fists at his sides, and when the service was over, he had gone home and written for 6 hours without stopping, filling 40 pages of a notebook with the legal architecture of what would eventually become the decree on the table behind him. 17 years later, he had signed it. He did not feel clean about it. He felt the ache that always lived behind his ribs when he thought about Lena, and underneath it a hollow satisfaction that was nothing like what he had imagined this moment would produce, and underneath that something he could not name. A sense of motion, something beginning. He moved away from the window, drank a glass of water standing at his desk, looked at the copy of the signed decree without opening it. Giles fell into step with him the moment he opened the chamber door. Aldrich asked whether the king had considered the political timing. Giles said, "I said the king considers everything and times it accordingly." "Good answer." Lord Fenn left immediately after the session, spoke to no one, went directly to his carriage. "Note it." "Already have." Lord Martin stayed in the corridor for approximately 3 minutes looking at nothing, and then left. "Martin is deciding which way his interests align," Kaelan said. "He'll have his answer by the end of the week." The Petition Intake Office received a filing from a delegation of Eastern Lords requesting a review of the inheritance classifications the decree will affect, Giles said. "The filing was time-stamped before you finished signing." Kaelan stopped walking. "Before I finished signing," he said. "Yes, they had the document's language in advance." Kaelan began walking again, same pace. Identify who prepared the petition, and identify which member of the scribing office had access to the draft before tonight. Tonight, Giles confirmed. They reached the private corridor. Giles stopped at the boundary he had held for 11 years. Kaelan continued alone. His rooms were warm. He stood at the fireplace for a long time without thinking, or rather thinking in the way that happens below thought, in the place where things settle into their correct weight without the assistance of language. Lena had liked fires. She had said once in the East Parlor during a winter visit when they were both young that fires were the only honest things in a house because they did not pretend to be something else. They burned until they were finished, and then they were ash, and the ash was as honest as the fire. He had thought that was a very wise thing to say. He had never told her. The fire crackled. A log shifted and threw a spray of orange sparks against the iron grate. He did not sleep well that night. He had not slept well in a long time and had made his peace with this, as a person makes peace with a leg that healed at the wrong angle, adjusting the walk, and not complaining about it to people who cannot fix it. What he did not know, sitting at his desk in the early hours while the rain finally eased, was that on the other side of the city, in a narrow building on a street that did not appear on the official city maps, a woman had been awake through the entire night. Not because of the rain, because she had been watching the palace windows. She had tracked the light in the council chamber for 3 hours. She had watched the lights go out, one by one, in the specific order of departure. She had watched the narrow lit window of the king's private corridor remain lit until nearly dawn. And then she had gone to her workbench, where 41 files were arranged in a precise order she had developed over years, and she had found the file at the very front of the stack, the one with no name on the cover. She had opened it, she had written 2 things, the date, the word signed. Then she had set down her pen and sat back and looked at the ceiling for a long time, and she had not looked afraid. She had looked like a woman who had just watched the first piece of a very large machine begin to move, and who knew exactly what came next, and who had not yet decided whether she was going to let it. Her name was Seraphine Voss, and in 3 weeks she was going to let herself be caught. The eastern quarter of the city was old in the way that parts of cities are old when they have been accumulated rather than built, layer over layer of habitation, old stone and newer wood, and the particular architectural logic of a place where space was expensive and necessity had driven every decision for 2 centuries. The streets folded into each other like the pages of a book that had been read too many times, the buildings tall and close, the light that reached street level having to negotiate with several stories of overhanging structure before arriving, thin and practical by the time it got there. The building on the unmarked street was on the 4th block past the old cloth market, set between a baker who started work before dawn and a woman who repaired clockwork mechanisms and who kept hours that no one had ever been able to fully account for. The building had a plain wooden door, unpainted. No number, no sign, no indication of function. The city planning office had assigned numbers to this street 30 years ago. The building had declined to participate, and the city planning office had moved on, and no one had since felt strongly enough to pursue the discrepancy. The neighbors knew what went on inside. They did not talk about it, in the specific way of people who have made a philosophical decision about the boundaries of their concern and are satisfied with where they have drawn it. The clock repair woman next door had told the baker that whatever was happening in that building was helping people, and the baker had shrugged in a way that contained his agreement. The clients who found it did so through the referral network in pieces from different people at different times, so that no single conversation could be traced back as the entry point. The street name in one meeting, the building description in another, the knock pattern 3 short, 2 long from a third person weeks later. This was not Seraphine's invention. It had evolved naturally from the first client to the second to the 42nd, the way networks evolve when the people inside them are careful. Seraphine had been operating from this building for 6 years. Before that, she had been in the Northern Market District for 2 years. Before that, a village 3 hours east. Before that, university. She had arrived at the university at 17 with a background in basic magical theory that her mother had taught her, environmental magic, the workings that dealt with weather and land and the living systems that moved through both, practical magic, the kind that was grounded in the world as it was rather than the world as it was theorized. She had enrolled in the Bond Studies program because it was the nearest available academic pathway to the questions that had been forming in her mind since she was 14 and had watched, in her home village, a woman be installed into a bond she had not chosen. The woman had been her mother's friend. She had been the kind of person who filled rooms with her presence, not loudly, not through performance, but through genuine attention and the specific magnetism of someone who found other people interesting. She had opinions about everything and shared them freely and laughed at herself often and at others rarely and had been, in the way of people who are fully themselves, both very easy and very pleasant to be near. And then she had been bonded, by arrangement, to a man her family chose for financial reasons. The wedding had been small, the reception had been strained, and then the woman had continued to exist technically, but the laughter had stopped and the opinions had stopped and the full presence had gone somewhere no one could locate, and what remained was a person-shaped thing that moved through the spaces her life required her to move through without any of the things that had made her a specific person rather than a general one. Seraphine had been 14 years old. She had looked at this woman and understood something that she would spend 15 years being able to articulate with increasing precision. The damage was not the bond itself. The damage was the absence of consent. The damage was being installed into a biological connection you had not agreed to, something that ran at the cellular level and that could not be ignored or argued with or outpaced, tethered to something wrong for you, and the wrongness slowly dismantling everything you had spent a life building. She had thought there should be a way to undo this. And then she had spent 15 years building one. At university, she had been thorough in a way that made the program's other students slightly uncomfortable, not because thoroughness was unwelcome, but because hers had a specific quality, a sense of weight and purpose behind every note and every question, as though she was not building knowledge for its own sake, but for something specific that required every piece she could accumulate. Her thesis committee had described the result, in their final review session, as either the most significant contribution to bond research in 30 years or an extremely sophisticated piece of legal threat, depending on which committee member you asked. 3 had voted to advance it, 2 had voted to suppress it. The suppression had been the end of her institutional life and the beginning of everything that mattered. She had walked out of the university with her research journals in the lining of her traveling coat and 14 years of work ahead of her. And on the first night in the rented room, after the specific kind of fury that arrives when you understand exactly what has been done to you and why has spent itself, she had opened a new notebook and begun. The building in the Eastern Quarter was the 5th location. It was the one she had stayed in longest. 6 years was the longest she had stayed anywhere since university, which told her something about the city and about the specific moment in the city's legal history that she had been watching develop since she arrived, which was not a coincidence. She had been watching Kalen's work since his 3rd year of deliberate counsel repositioning. She had identified the pattern before most political observers had noticed the individual moves. The specific sequence of judicial appointments, the quiet amendments to procedural law that appeared to be housekeeping but were in fact foundation laying, the careful shifting of the council's compositional center of gravity. It was unmistakable if you knew what it was building toward. She had known what it was building toward because she had been building toward the same destination from the other direction for 6 years. She had verified the pre-bond diagnostic for the 7th time in the week after she moved into the Eastern Quarter building. Not because she doubted the result, she had stopped doubting it after the 3rd verification, but because 7 was a number that meant, in her personal methodology, that she had checked something as many times as she was going to check it, and would now proceed on the basis that the result was accurate. The result was accurate. She had spent 14 years separating what she felt about it from what she was going to do about it, because those were not the same question, and conflating them would undermine both. What she felt about it she kept in the personal section of the 5th research journal, in her shorthand, in language that was not available to anyone who did not have 11 years of practice reading her notes. It was not a long section. She was not a person who gave large amounts of space to things she could not yet act on. What she was going to do about it she had planned in 5 distinct phases, the first of which was already complete, and the second of which was nearly complete, and the third of which was the one she was currently in, which was, wait for the decree. 3 weeks after it was signed, she posted the sign. It was a plain sign, letters in black on light wood. Bond arbitration and dissolution services, consultation by appointment, her name, the address. She posted it on the public board outside the Market Archive at 7 in the morning on a clear day, because she wanted it to be seen, and because she had checked, 4 times, that the language was entirely within the parameters of the severance decree's new legal framework, and that no one could bring her in for the sign itself. What they could do, and what she was expecting they would do, was find a complaint that fell within the decree's enforcement provisions, and use that complaint to bring her in formally. She had identified the most likely complaint before she posted the sign. It was the Crest daughter case. Lord Crest's family was aggressive about protecting their legal positions, and the dissolution of his daughter's bond had land implications that he would understand immediately and act on quickly. She estimated 11 days. She was right to within 4 hours. The 2 Crown officers knocked at 3 in the afternoon on the 11th day. She had the coat by the door already. She opened the door before they knocked a second time and told them she was ready. They looked at each other with the expression of people who had prepared for resistance and were now encountering its opposite, and were not certain what protocol covered that situation. She put on the coat, She said goodbye to the building without saying it aloud. She followed the officers out. The street was ordinary around them. Market day, a vendor rearranging fruit, two children arguing in front of the clockmaker's door, no one paying any specific attention to a woman walking between two palace officers, because that was not a thing the Eastern Quarter found remarkable enough to focus on. She noted the route they took, wider than the most direct path through the more visible streets. Deliberate, she filed it. At the intake office, she had been watching the back door since she came in. When it opened, she was already watching it. Kalen walked in. She had known he was tall. She had known he favored plain working clothes for internal business. She had known about the quality of his presence from accounts, from the way people described rooms after he had been in them. She had not fully accounted for the immediate, unambiguous, cellular accuracy of her own diagnostic. The bond pull was not painful, it was not dramatic, it was the equalization of a pressure she had been holding without realizing she was holding it, the specific quality of something resolving into its correct position. Clean, distinct, identifiable as exactly what it was. She felt it completely, she filed it. She did not let it change her posture or her expression. She looked at him. He looked at her. She watched him feel it. She could see it. The stillness that arrived in him was not his professional stillness, which she had identified through accounts and observation and was a specific thing. This was a different quality, a man who did not show most things showing something. "Seraphine Voss," he said. "Your Majesty," she said. The Crown officers had developed an intense interest in the wall to her left. She told him about the Crest case. She gave him the daughter's age, the bond's arrangement, the land implications. She gave him the number 42 cases, 14 years, and she watched him absorb it without any visible assessment of what it meant beyond what it literally said, which was the behavior of a person who was reserving judgment until they had all the information. She gave him Lord Fenn's family connections without being asked, because they were directly relevant to why Lord Fenn had filed an anonymous complaint about the Public Notice Board before the Crown officers had even arrived at her door. She watched the two officers exchange a glance they did not think she noticed. When he offered the palace rooms, she had been expecting an inquiry or a formal legal process. She had not been expecting this exact shape of the thing, this particular solution, and she allowed herself 1/2 second to adjust her internal modeling before responding. She said she would need her case files. They said they would send officers. She said she would need to go herself. She had planned to say that. The files were organized in a system that looked chaotic to anyone outside it, and that would survive approximately 4 minutes of well-intentioned reorganization by palace officers before becoming unusable. He agreed. She went, she came back. The rooms in the eastern wing were given. The case files were installed, the work began. On the 4th day, the library access came through. On the 7th evening, she went to the library's 2nd floor at 8 o'clock and found a lamp already lit at the east table, which was information. The footsteps she had been learning to identify arrived. "You're working late," he said. "I work late every night," she said. "The lights in your corridor suggest you do too." A pause that contained more information than most sentences. "You've been tracking my corridor window," he said. "I've been noting ambient light patterns from my room," she said. "Your corridor is visible from my window. I'm not surveilling you." "That's not quite a denial," he said. "No," she agreed, "it isn't." He sat down. One seat to the side, not directly across. She noted this, not a confrontational positioning, a being near positioning. "How is the amendment draft?" he said. "Done. I left it on your desk this morning." "I read it," he said. "Section 3's burden of proof standard, the Council will challenge it." They should. The standard is deliberately low to protect subjects who can't access formal documentation. The challenge is anticipated, and the answer is in Section 4. "I saw it, it holds." A pause. "You wrote the counterargument to your own provision." "I wrote it because my opponents will make it," she said. "Better to answer it before they ask." He was quiet for a moment. "You anticipated every challenge." "Most of them, you'll find others. Your legal office will find others. That's why I'm here." The room was very quiet. The books held their positions. The lamp made its warm circle without commentary. "Miss Voss," he said. Seraphine, she said without looking up, you've known my name for over a week. The formal address has started to feel like you're reminding yourself of something. A longer pause. Seraphine, he said, and the way he said it was very careful, the way a person picks up something they are not yet sure how to hold. She kept her eyes on the document. You submitted your consultation anonymously to the drafting process, he said, 14 months ago. Yes, sir. You had been watching the decree's development. Yes, sir. For how long? She set down the pen, she looked at the east window. 7 years, she said. Something shifted in the quality of his attention. She could not have said precisely what changed, only that the room held it differently. 7 years, he said. I've been monitoring bond law reform in this kingdom for 7 years. Your work specifically for 6. You were careful about visibility until you had the council composition you needed, but the pattern was there for someone who knew what to look for. And you knew what to look for. I've been studying this system for 14 years, she said. Every piece of it. When you began repositioning your judicial appointments, I recognized the architecture. He was quiet. That is a long time to watch a stranger, he said. You want a stranger, she said carefully. You were the person who was going to sign the only law that would make my work legally possible. Watching the law's development was professional necessity. And if I hadn't signed it, I would have continued anyway, she said. He looked at her. I believe you, he said. I know, she said. In the library, with the books and the lamp and the rain-cleaned air coming through the crack she had left in the window, she finished 3 pages of the amendment revision, and he worked through the treaty petition from the Eastern Lords, and neither of them spoke unnecessarily, and the necessary things that were said were precise and sufficient. At midnight she asked him about Lena. Not directly, she said, the person behind the decree. He did not answer for a long time. Then he said, my cousin's age. She died 15 years ago. I know, Seraphine said. He looked at her. I have the file, she said. I found it in the provincial medical records 11 years ago. The symptoms were documented as fever. They were not fever. The silence was very particular. You've had her file for 11 years, he said. Yes, and you didn't. You weren't ready, she said. You were building the law. You needed to build it from what you already knew. And sending documentation about a 15-year-old death in your family through anonymous channels without knowing whether it would help or destabilize was not something I was going to do without being certain. You made that judgment, he said, not accusing, observing. Yes, she said. I make judgments like that. It's part of what I do. Part of what you do as a practitioner, he said. Yes, not as someone who had been watching my work for 6 years, because of something that was not only professional. The lamp between them was very steady. She had been careful about this since the intake office. Every day in this palace, in every conversation, in this specific man's presence. She had been careful because she understood what was underneath the professional arrangement, and because the careful thing was the right thing, and because she was not going to allow anything, not the bond, not proximity, not 14 years of waiting, to move her before she had decided to move. But he was asking, and she had decided, at 19 in a rented room with a single lamp, that when the moment came she would not be a person who evaded it. Seraphine, he said, I am a wolf. I know what certain things feel like when they are present in a room. She looked at him. I know what it feels like when something is not only professional, he said, and I know what it feels like to be the only person in a room pretending not to notice it. You are not the only person pretending not to notice it, she said. The room was very quiet. I have known about the pre-bond diagnostic since I was 19, she said. I ran the diagnostic on myself as part of my research. The spell returned a result I was not expecting. I spent 6 months verifying it before I allowed myself to proceed on its basis. He was absolutely still. The pre-bond, he said, a potential, a thread in the fate magic before proximity activates it. Yes, she said, I identified it, I verified it, and I decided that if this was going to eventually enter the room, I was going to arrive at it completely prepared. That is why you spent 14 years on the research, he said, not a question. The research was necessary regardless, she said. The cases I've taken on were real and the people in them needed help. But yes, the personal element is part of why I did not stop, even when stopping would have been easier. And now, he said, now I am in the palace and the decree is signed, and the amendment is drafted, and we are in the library at midnight, and you are asking me the right question. Which is, She looked at him. Which is whether what is between us is only what the bond built. And the honest answer is that I've been calculating that for 11 years and I do not yet have a complete result, because the calculation requires data that I could not gather until proximity, and I have been in proximity for less than 2 weeks. And what does the early data say? He said. She looked at the lamp. That the number is not what I was expecting, she said, and that I am going to need more time to be certain. How much time? He said. I don't know, she said. However long it takes to run the calculation correctly. He sat with that. I have a ritual, she said. I've had it prepared since before I came here. I brought the components. The ritual can dissolve the pre-bond before full activation. It would be complete and clean. I've performed the theoretical analysis on it more times than any other procedure in my practice. And you're telling me this, he said. Because you have the right to know it exists, she said. Because you signed a law that says people deserve real choices made of real information. And if that means anything, it has to mean it applies to you. He looked at her for a long time. Keep it ready, he said. Not because I intend to ask for it tonight, but I understand why you have it. She nodded once. They returned to work. She finished the amendment revision. He finished the petition response. At 2 in the morning she went to her room. She stood for a moment at the desk and looked at the top drawer. She did not open it. She went to bed. In the morning the council records access was on her desk with the king's seal, and she made tea, and she went to work. The first week inside the palace had a texture that Seraphine had not entirely anticipated. She had anticipated the work, which arrived immediately and abundantly. 42 case files took physical space, and the organization of them into the palace room had required 3 full days of methodical sorting, cross-referencing, and re-establishing the notation system she had developed over 6 years so that everything was accessible in the order she would need it. She had anticipated this. She had not anticipated that organizing 42 cases in a room she had not previously inhabited would make the room feel immediately and irrevocably hers, the way a space becomes yours when you have filled it with work you care about. She had not anticipated the palace staff. The palace staff was efficient, cheerful, and had apparently decided on the first evening that Miss Voss was a person who needed to be cared for in the specific way of people who forget to take care of themselves when they are working. Food appeared at regular intervals. The fire was lit in the evenings without her noticing when it happened. Fresh candles replaced the old ones while she was at meals. A second board appeared in the room on the 3rd day with a note from Giles that said simply, "His Majesty indicated you would need this for the cross-reference." She had not asked for the board. She had been planning to ask for it. She had been specifically planning to ask for it that afternoon. She had stood in front of the board for a moment with a strange feeling in her chest that it took her a moment to identify as something in the neighborhood of being known. The small version of it. The version that arrives not when a person sees deeply into you, but when they simply pay attention to the practical realities of your situation and act on them without being asked. She pinned the first cross-reference map to the board. She went back to work. The palace library became hers in the same way. She had been granted access on the 4th day and had gone in the evening to the 2nd floor, which was the working floor rather than the ceremonial floor, and had found it exactly what she needed: large tables, good lamplight, the specific silence of a room that had been used for sustained thinking for several hundred years, and had learned how to hold it. She had a professional question about the library, whether any of its holdings contained bond research that predated the university's program. She spent 2 evenings investigating this before she had a usable answer, which was, yes, in limited quantity in the archive section, in materials that had not been formally catalogued, and that required the kind of systematic search she conducted with focused attention and good notes. She found 3 texts she had not previously encountered. 2 of them added nothing significant to her existing understanding. One of them, a handwritten practitioner's journal from approximately 200 years ago, unsigned, written in a regional dialect that required her to spend an hour with a language reference before she could read it, contained a description of what appeared to be an early dissolution method that was theoretically interesting and practically inadequate, but that suggested the practice was older than any institutional record had indicated. She added a note to her research journal. She continued working. On the fifth evening, he came to the library. She had heard the footsteps and identified them. She had been identifying them for 3 days, cataloging the sound the way she cataloged every recurring element of her environment, building the pattern until it was as distinct to her as a voice before she looked up. When she looked up, he was standing in the doorway of the reading room with a document in his hand and an expression that was reading her workspace and her board extensions and the archive materials she had spread across the table. "You're working late," he said, for the second time in their acquaintance. "I work late every night," she said for the second time, "as I believe I mentioned." "Yes," he said, "you mentioned it." He came in. He sat down at the other end of the table, which was an interesting choice, not beside her as he had done on the previous library evening, but at some distance, as though he was still determining the appropriate geography of the room between them. She noted this without moving. He opened his document. He began to read. She went back to the archive journal. They worked in silence for approximately 40 minutes. The silence was not awkward, which told her something. Awkward silence was the silence of two people performing the absence of conversation. This was something else, a functional silence, the kind that happened between people who had enough going on internally and on the page in front of them that the lack of speech was simply the correct condition of the room. At some point he said, without looking up, "The cross-reference map on the second board, the notation in the third column, is that indicating time between arrangement and transfer or time between arrangement and the subject's first presentation of effects?" She looked at the board. "Time between arrangement and transfer," she said. "The effects timeline is in the fourth column, which I haven't filled in yet. I need the council land records to complete it." "The access authorization comes through tomorrow morning," he said. "I moved it forward." She looked at him. He was still reading his document. "Thank you," she said. "The fourth column will be significant," he said, "for the amendments enforcement framework." "Yes," she said. "That's why I need it." He nodded and went back to his document. She went back to the archive journal. At 11 o'clock she gathered her materials and said good night, and he said good night, and she went to her room and stood at the window for a moment looking at the garden below, which was dark and still. And she thought about the specific quality of the silence in that library, and the fact that it had not been awkward, and the fact that he had known about the fourth column before she had explained it, and the fact that the board had arrived without her asking. She thought about the locked box in the drawer. She thought about the calculation and what it was telling her, and whether she was reading it correctly or whether the proximity was affecting her ability to read it correctly, which was a methodological concern she took seriously. She thought about the fact that she had designed a 14-year research program partly because she wanted to be able to trust herself in exactly this situation, to know that what she was feeling was what she thought it was, to know the difference. She checked her methodology. She went to bed. In the morning, the council land records access was on the desk, and she started on the fourth column, and by the afternoon the cross-reference had a shape that was the clearest picture she had ever assembled of how the bond system had been functioning as a financial instrument, and she looked at it and thought, this is what it was. This is what it always was. This is what Lena died for. She closed the board cover. She went to dinner. She came back and she opened the first case file and she worked until midnight, and then she went to sleep. That was how the first week went. By the end of it, the palace room was her room. The library at 8 o'clock was her library time. The work was her work. And the particular quality of a king who noticed that someone needed a board and moved a document authorization forward because the fourth column mattered. That quality was something she was keeping careful and precise notes about in the section of her journal that no one else could read. The palace had a rhythm that Seraphine learned the way she learned everything, systematically, by observation, until the pattern was clear enough to use. Mornings belonged to official business. The council met in formal session on Tuesdays and Thursdays, but the work of the council happened every day in the smaller rooms, the meeting rooms and the review chambers and the offices of the various lords and their secretaries. a continuous low-level activity of documentation and deliberation that was the actual machinery of governance, largely invisible behind the ceremonial version. Afternoons were when things were decided, not announced, that happened in the formal sessions, but decided in the way decisions actually happen, in conversations and in documents reviewed, and in the specific weight of attention a king brought to a briefing paper. Evenings, if you were not a lord with social obligations or a council member with a block to maintain, were your own. Seraphine had not had evenings that were her own in 6 years. In the Eastern Quarter building, evenings were when clients sometimes came because clients who were hiding from the people who had arranged their bonds did not always arrive in broad daylight. Evenings were when she did her most complex research because evenings were quiet and the quiet helped her think. In the palace, evenings became the library. It happened without planning it. She had simply gone to the library on the first evening she was allowed access, and she had gone on the second evening, and by the third evening it was the thing she did, and by the fifth evening Kaelan had started arriving partway through, and by the end of the second week, the library at 8 o'clock had a shape it had not had at the beginning, the shape of something that is regular enough to be expected without being so rigid as to feel like obligation. She found she liked it. This was information she noted. She found she liked the way the library held the specific quality of two people working on different things in the same room, the slight sounds of papers moving, the occasional lamp adjustment, the specific quality of another person's concentration that was different from being alone without being an interruption. She had spent 14 years largely alone with her work. She had not known before this that the alone had been a condition she was making do with rather than a condition she had chosen. She was careful not to read too much into this. She was careful, in general, to separate what the bond was building from what the rest of it was building, because the methodology required the separation, and she had built the methodology precisely for this moment. But she noted it. She added it to the calculation. She kept working. The council staff became familiar. The head scribe, Mrs. Cornett, was a woman of 50 who had been running the council's documentation office for 20 years, and who had, Seraphine thought, the most comprehensive memory of what the council had actually decided versus what it had formally recorded of anyone in the building. She was not an ally exactly, she was too careful for that word, but she was a person who understood what documents meant, and who gave Seraphine's files the specific quality of respectful attention that a good professional gives to another person's good work. The intake office coordinator, a younger man named Harold, had initially looked at Seraphine with the wariness of someone whose job had recently become considerably more complicated because of her presence. He looked at her with the same wariness for the first 3 weeks. By the end of the 4th week, after she had restructured the intake documentation process to make it faster and less redundant, and had consulted him extensively about what aspects of the previous system were working and what were not, he looked at her with something closer to the wariness of a person who suspects they are going to be significantly busier indefinitely, but is beginning to feel that the business is worthwhile. She liked Harold. She told him this at the end of the 4th week, which visibly surprised him, because he was a person who was accustomed to being useful rather than acknowledged. "You are a very good intake coordinator," she told him. "Your system for tracking case numbers is better than the one I was using in the Eastern Quarter. I'm going to adopt it." He stared at her for a moment, then he said, "Thank you, Miss Voss." "Crown practitioner," she said, not as a correction, as an acknowledgement of where they both now stood. "Crown practitioner," he said, with, she thought, a faint trace of pride that she found disproportionately pleasing. She went back to her office. She opened the case files. She worked. Giles she had learned early and learned well. Giles was the kind of person who made himself so consistently reliable that his reliability became invisible, which was either a personal failing or a professional skill, depending on what you were trying to accomplish. She thought it was the second. She thought Kaelan had chosen him for exactly this quality, a person who was present without being intrusive, who knew the difference between information that needed to be passed along and information that did not, who carried 11 years of institutional memory about this specific king in a way that was useful without being presumptuous. She thought Giles probably understood the situation better than he let on. She thought Giles had understood it since the intake office. She did not raise this. She simply incorporated it into how she operated around him, which was direct, clear, and efficient, because those were the qualities Giles responded to and the qualities that made working with him useful rather than merely functional. On the 14th day, Giles knocked at her office door in the mid-afternoon and said, "His Majesty would like a brief meeting, when you have a moment." "Now," she said. "I'll let him know," Giles said. She brought the cross-reference document. She went to the working office. Kalen was reviewing something when she came in, and he set it aside in the way that meant it was being set aside rather than interrupted, because he had learned or perhaps had always known that there was a difference. "The inquiry is in 2 days," he said. "Yes," she said. "Aldrich has requested that I not attend personally," he said. "He filed the request through the council secretary." "Of course he did," she said. "Your attendance changes the weight of the proceedings. He wants it to look like an administrative review rather than a crown priority." "Yes," he said, "I'm going to deny the request." "I know," she said. He looked at her. "I knew when Aldrich filed the request," she said. "It was the move of a person who is trying to limit the formal significance of the inquiry because he has begun to suspect the inquiry is not going to go the way he planned. The request itself is evidence that his confidence in the outcome has dropped. You denying it confirms the Crown's position. Your anticipation of these things," he said, "continues to be slightly uncanny." "I've been modeling this council for 6 years," she said. "Aldrich operates within a consistent strategic framework. Once you understand the framework, the specific moves are predictable." "And my moves," he said. She looked at him. "You're less predictable," she said. "You have the same consistency of principle, but you're more willing to act in ways that disrupt your own strategic position when the principle requires it. Aldrich optimizes for his position. You optimize for the outcome." He was quiet for a moment. "And the difference matters," he said. "Yes," she said, "significantly. People who optimize for position can be predicted by knowing their position. People who optimize for outcome can only be predicted by knowing their principles." "And you know my principles," he said. "I've been studying them for 6 years," she said. "Yes." He looked at her for a moment, not the professional look, not the analyzing look, something else. "The inquiry," he said, returning to the surface. "The inquiry will go the way I've planned it," she said. "I've told you that." "Yes," he said, "I know." She set the cross-reference document on his desk. "The final version," she said, "with the council land records incorporated. You'll want to read it before the session." He picked it up, he opened it. He read the first 3 pages without saying anything. 312, he said, in Fenn's records alone. 312 over 22 years, she said. The ones we can document. There may be earlier ones that predate the records I have access to. He set down the document, he looked at it. "Lena," he said. "Lena is not in Fenn's record," she said. "The arrangement that bonded Lena was Harwick's family, different network, the connection is indirect." "But the same system," he said. "The same system," she confirmed. "Fenn's is the most documented example. The system runs considerably wider." He picked the document back up. "I'll read the full document tonight," he said. "Take your time," she said. "You have 2 days." She went back to her office. She stood at the window for a moment. The garden below was in its late afternoon light, the shadows long and the colors warm. She thought about the system, the way it had operated for decades quietly and within the law because the law had been built to permit it. She thought about the 42 people in her files. She thought about Case 3. She thought about tomorrow's work, and the day after's inquiry and the week after's amendment vote. She thought about the locked box in the drawer. She sat down. She opened the case file she had been working on before Giles came to get her. She went back to work. Lord Fenn had spent 22 years building an empire on the understanding that certain rules only applied to certain people, and that he was not one of those people. This was not a cynical position exactly. It was simply the worldview of a man whose entire adult life had provided consistent evidence that the rules did in fact apply differently depending on who you were and what you controlled. He had tested the proposition at 22 with his first land acquisition, conducted through a bond arrangement that was technically within the letter of existing law and technically a violation of its spirit, and the world had responded by giving him the land. He had tested it again at 25 and 30 and 37, and the world had continued to respond in the same way, and by 61, the proposition had calcified from hypothesis into axiom. He had been on the High Council for 14 years. In that time, he had voted against 12 pieces of legislation that would have restricted bond arrangements, and had been the primary architect of the council narrative that described such restrictions as interference with natural wolf biology. He had used the language of instinct and tradition and species preservation in chambers, in private meetings, in formal addresses to regional lords. He had used it so many times with such consistency that it had become, in some portions of the council, the air that the other arguments breathed. The severance decree had not broken him. He had seen worse in 14 years of council work. Laws could be signed. Laws could also be interpreted, challenged, eroded from the inside by people who were patient, and who understood that formal legal structures were always more porous than they appeared in the moment of signing. The inquiry into Seraphine Voss had been his idea. The logic was simple and good. Bring the practitioner informally, challenge her methodology under the pre-decree statutes that still technically governed the cases she had conducted before the law changed, create a legal cloud over her practice's history, and use that cloud to challenge the validity of the dissolutions she had already performed. It would stall the enforcement of the decree, create grounds for the noble families to contest their affected cases, and buy time for the council to mount a more fundamental challenge to the amendment that everyone knew was coming. Aldrich had agreed immediately. Crest had joined them. The complaint had been drafted by the best legal mind Fenn had access to and filed through Crest's name to provide slightly more plausible distance. Fenn arrived at the inquiry 8 minutes early. He sat down with Aldrich on his left and Crest on his right. He had arranged them deliberately. Their physical presence together at the table was itself a signal, a demonstration of block weight, of aligned interest, of the specific kind of council unity that made individual proceedings feel like formalities awaiting their foregone conclusions. Callan was already seated at the head of the table. Fenn recalibrated silently. The king's personal attendance at council inquiries was not unprecedented, but it was uncommon enough to be significant. He filed it and did not allow it to change his expression. Seraphine Voss was at the table's center on the right side. She had files, a great many of them stacked with a precision that Fenn had spent 40 years learning to read. The stacks were tall, the tabs were color-coded. The arrangement suggested complete knowledge of the order in which she was going to address things. It did not suggest a woman who had spent the last 2 weeks preparing a defense. It suggested a woman who had spent the last 11 years preparing a prosecution. Fenn looked at Callan. Callan looked at nothing specific. Lord Fenn, Callan said, your complaint alleges Miss Voss's practice violated the pre-decree bond protection statutes, specifically in the matter of Lady Helen Crest. Is that the basis of the inquiry? It is, Fenn said. Specifically, the case of Lady Helen, conducted without family notification or proper legal oversight, which under the bond protection statutes in effect at the time of the dissolution constitutes. We'll reach the Crest case, Callan said. First, I would like Miss Voss to present her full documentation. Fenn stopped. The inquiry as filed is specific to the Crest case. The procedural guidelines establish. As presiding authority, I am broadening the scope, Callan said. It was not a loud statement, it was simply final. Miss Voss. She opened the first file. For the first 3 minutes, Fenn thought it was a standard practice defense. Thorough, well-organized, but within the expected parameters of what a practitioner would bring to a formal inquiry. He had prepared for this. His legal team had prepared for this. At the 4-minute mark, she introduced the cross-reference documentation. At the 7-minute mark, he understood that what she was presenting was not a defense of her practice. It was a systematic documentation of every non-consensual bond arrangement she had encountered in 14 years of practice, organized by family connection, with the arranging parties named, the financial instruments attached to each arrangement identified, and the outcomes for the subjects documented in clinical detail. The families were not redacted, the names were in the files clearly with dates. At the 12-minute mark, Lord Crest stopped looking at her and began studying the surface of the table with the focused attention of a man who had made a decision about where to direct his eyes. At the 20-minute mark, Aldrich had achieved a stillness that Fenn recognized as the stillness of a man running parallel calculations about what the next 3 to 6 months of his counsel position would look like. At the 30-minute mark, she reached the Western Holdings. She walked through 4 cases. She named the parties. She produced the land transfer records that she had obtained through the council's own archive. She showed the sequence, the bond arrangement, the date, the land transfer, the date, the legal mechanism by which the bond enabled the transfer, the beneficiary. She read his name the way she read everything, clearly, without emphasis. She did not look at him. At the 40-minute mark, she reached case 44. She described a young man of 20, a guardian and financial trustee who had arranged a bond for him. She said the dissolution had been conducted 3 months prior, voluntarily, with full documentation. She said the subject's name was not in the formal record because the subject had not consented to public disclosure, but that she could provide it to the presiding authority for private verification. She closed the last file. Fenn looked at his hands. His son had gone to her 3 months ago. His son, who had been quiet at dinner last week in a way that was different from his usual quiet, who had looked across the table at his father with an expression Fenn had registered but not examined because he had been thinking about the inquiry and the complaint and the strategy for the next several months. 3 months ago, while Fenn was in the palace for council sessions, his son had gone to a woman in the Eastern Quarter and had undone, quietly and without his father's knowledge, the arrangement that was the foundation of the land transfer in the Western Holdings that Fenn had spent the last 2 years protecting. The structure had not been dismantled. It had already been dismantled. He had been protecting something that had already fallen. Lord Fenn, Kaelan said. Fenn did not look up immediately. Lord Fenn. He looked up. The inquiry into Miss Voss's practice is closed. The documentation she has presented will be entered into the Crown's formal record and referred for action. The cases involving your family's Western Holdings land transfers will be referred to the Crown's legal office for independent audit. He paused. You are excused from the council for the duration of that audit. Aldrich was very still to Fenn's left. Crest had his eyes on the table. Fenn stood. He was 61 years old and had built a great deal, and had not expected to be standing in a small council room at the end of a 45-minute presentation by a woman he had tried to suppress at 19, understanding that the structure was gone. But here he was. Your Majesty, he said, I would like to. You're excused, Kaelan said, and the quiet that held that sentence was complete. Fenn left. Aldrich and Crest followed, in the specific configuration of men who want to indicate alliance, but also understand that remaining in a room you have clearly lost is a tactical error. The door closed. Seraphine stacked the final file. She placed the stacks in order. Case 44 subject, Kaelan said, Fenn's son. Yes, she said. He came to you while his father was building the council narrative against the decree. Yes, he's known what his father has been doing for 3 years, since he came of age and could read the financial structures clearly. He is not his father. Kaelan was quiet. The amendment's retroactive review provision, he said, it would protect him. The dissolution would be documented under Crown authority without requiring him to come forward publicly. Yes, that's what the provision does. I know, he said quietly, I know what the provision does. Something in the way he said it told her that he had been thinking about exactly this, not about the provision in the abstract, but about the specific people it would protect, the ones like Fenn's son, the ones who had done the right thing before the framework existed to make it safe to do. She did not say anything about this, she simply noted it. 3 days for the draft, he said. 3 days, she confirmed. At the door she paused. The university suppression, she said. The complaint that was filed anonymously to the department head, it was Fenn. He was quiet. The complaint was filed anonymously, she said. It took me 2 years to trace it, it was Fenn. He looked at the table for a long moment, not at anything specifically on the table. At a point somewhere behind the table's surface, where he was filing something in the internal location where he kept things that mattered in a specific way. 3 days, he said. She left. In the corridor, she stood for a moment with the files held against her chest. She had planned for the inquiry. She had planned for Fenn's reaction and the council's discomfort and the specific legal outcome. She had planned for the documentation and the cross-reference and the precise sequence in which she would present things. She had not planned for the way Kalen looked at the table when she told him about the university. The weight in that moment. The specific quality of a man who had just been given a piece of information that completed a picture he had been building for a long time, and who understood what completing the picture meant. She had not planned for the way that moved something in her chest that was not the bond pull, something quieter and more specific. She filed it, she went back to her room, she began the draft. She wrote for 3 days without stopping except for sleep and meals, both of which she allocated exactly the time they required and no more. The draft was 16 pages when finished. She cut it to 14. She added 3 pages of precedent citations. She wrote the counterargument to her own provision in Section 4, because the counterargument was the one Aldrich would make, and she wanted it answered before he made it. She read through the full draft one final time, made 2 small adjustments, and put it in an envelope. She left it on Kalen's desk at 7 in the morning. At 10 o'clock that night, Giles knocked and handed her a single page in Kalen's handwriting. The Section 4 counterargument holds, "I am adjusting the language in Section 3 to accommodate the probable objection to the burden of proof standard. Can you review the adjusted language tomorrow morning?" She wrote back, "Yes, leave the adjusted language on the library desk. I will be there from 8. She gave the note to Giles. She went back to her workbench. She looked at her reflection in the dark window. She was smiling. She went to bed. The days between the inquiry and the amendment vote had a specific character that Seraphine would later think of as the days of the cross-reference. She had been given council land records access, and she used it systematically, working through the files in the order she had determined would produce the clearest picture the fastest. It was not alphabetical order. It was not chronological order. It was the order that a person works in when they understand the structure of what they are looking for, starting at the places where the structure was most visible, using those to anchor the understanding of the places where it was less visible, building outward from the clear cases toward the complicated ones. Lord Fenn's holdings were the clearest. The pattern was almost architectural in its regularity. Bond arrangement in the autumn, land transfer completed by the following spring, repeat at 2 to 3 year intervals across 22 years. She had known the pattern existed from her case files. The land transfer records confirmed the specific mechanism, which was more elegant than she had fully appreciated from the outside. The bond arrangements were timed to produce inheritance conditions that existed during specific windows of property law enforcement, windows that Fenn's legal advisors had apparently known to look for, and that the Crown's legal office had apparently not been watching. This was not stupidity on the Crown's part. It was the expected behavior of an enforcement office that was looking at individual cases rather than the pattern across cases, which was how all enforcement offices worked, unless someone forced them to look at the pattern. Seraphine was forcing them to look at the pattern. She spent 4 of the days working on nothing but the cross-reference, and by the end of the 4th day she had a document that was, she believed, the clearest systematic picture of what the bond as financial instrument had looked like in practice over the past 20 years that had ever been assembled anywhere in the kingdom. It was also devastating in the specific way of clear evidence, not emotionally devastating, though the emotional weight of what it documented was real. Devastating in the structural sense. Devastating in the sense of a thing that, once seen, could not be unseen, that changed the basic shape of how the council's existing narrative about the bond system held up. It didn't hold up. She organized the document in the order she would present it at the inquiry, which she had been planning since before she came to the palace. She had an amendment draft almost complete. She had a practitioner authorization argument that she had been refining for 2 years. She had, arrayed in the case files on the board in the palace room, 42 of the most carefully documented records of the bond system's human cost that existed anywhere. She was ready. The night before the inquiry, she sat in the library and worked through the presentation one more time. Kalen arrived at 9:30. He sat at the table and opened a report he was reviewing, and they worked in the same comfortable functional silence that had settled in over the past 10 days. And at some point around 11 he set down his document and looked at the board she had brought from her room, which was the first board with the cross-reference already completed, and he said, "You're ready for tomorrow." It was not a question. Yes, she said. You've been ready for a long time, he said. 11 years, she said, for this specific inquiry, longer for the broader work. He was quiet for a moment. The people in your files, he said, the ones who came to the Eastern Quarter, the ones who found the building. Yes. They came to you because there was nowhere else to go, he said. Yes, she said. And tomorrow there will be somewhere else to go, he said. And the day after the amendment passes there will be a formal process. And the day after the authorization vote there will be a practitioner with a crown seal on the wall. Yes, she said. You did that, he said. She looked at him. The decree made it legally possible, she said. You did that. The decree is law, he said. The law is a framework. The framework requires someone to work inside it. You built the body of practice that the framework can function through. That is not a small thing. She looked at the board for a moment, at the 40 cross-reference cases and the 20-year pattern and the family names and the land transfers. At the 412 people she did not yet know she was going to close files for, who were at this moment distributed across the kingdom living inside situations, this document was going to change. Lena built it, she said, in the way that the people who show you what is wrong build everything that comes after. He was very still. Yes, he said, she did. They sat in the library for another hour. They did not say anything else that was significant. They worked, in the way they had learned to work together in 10 days, which was efficiently and without the need for the other person to validate the direction they were going. At midnight she gathered the board and her notes. At the door she paused. The inquiry will go the way I've planned it, she said. I want you to know that. He looked at her. I know, he said. I'm not looking for reassurance, she said. I'm giving you information so you can plan accordingly. I know, he said again. I've been planning accordingly since the day you told me you had 42 documented cases and 14 years of practice. She nodded. Good night, she said. Good night, he said. She went to her room. She looked at the organized files one more time. She turned off the lamp. She slept. In the morning she was ready. The amendment to the severance decree went before the High Council on a Thursday morning, 11 days after the inquiry, in the main chamber. Kalin presented it himself, which was not standard for amendments. Amendments were typically introduced through the council secretary and debated before the king was called to arbitrate. This was Kalin's signal that the debate had already happened, and this session was for the vote. Seraphine gave her testimony in the morning session. 2 hours, the most technically precise, factually dense, legally airtight presentation she had produced in 14 years, and she had produced 41 comparable efforts in her practice. She used no emotional language. She used only documentation, precedent, logical sequence, and the specific structure of an argument that has been tested against every counter it will face before the counter has been made. When she was done, the council deliberated. She waited in the witness corridor, which connected to the chamber through a narrow door. She sat on the bench provided. She read through the intake form for a new case that had come in that morning, because sitting with nothing to do was a waste. The vote came through the door via the assigned scribe, a piece of folded paper. She opened it. 7-5. She read it twice. She had projected 7-5 as the most likely outcome, and had prepared simultaneously for 6-6 and a tie-breaking royal decision, which she had put at 30% probability. The 7-5 outcome meant Crest had voted for the amendment, which she had modeled as the option with the highest probability but not the certainty. Crest was a pragmatic man. His daughter's case was in the process of resolving, and the resolution would include a finding about the land transfer attached to the original bond. Crest had done the arithmetic. Giles came through the door. She followed him into the chamber. The room was in the post-vote state of a room that has just finished something significant, conversations breaking up, people redistributing toward exits, the mixed energy of conclusion and beginning. Aldrich was near the far wall with 2 of his block members in a configuration that was clearly planning the next move, but had the sense to do it quietly. Kalin was at the head of the table. The room emptied. The scribes filed their records and left. Giles moved into the side corridor. It was Kalin and Seraphine, and the large quiet room, and the 17 oil portraits looking down at no one in particular. 7-5, she said. Crest's daughter and the land claim, he said. Yes, pragmatic rather than principled, but the vote holds the same way either way. The practitioner authorization vote, he said. I'm scheduling it for next week. She looked at him. You're moving fast. 200 pending cases. The amendment without a licensed practitioner is a legal framework with no one to work inside it. It needs enforcement. Aldrich will challenge the authorization, she said. His argument will be that authorizing someone who practiced without a license for 6 years sets a precedent for. It does set a precedent, Kalin said. The precedent is that, when the law was wrong and someone did necessary work outside it, the correct response is to correct the law's classification of the work, rather than penalize the person who did it. She looked at him. That's the argument, he said. Yes, she said, that is exactly the argument. I have it written, 6 pages, 2 of which are precedent citations from the Crown's own historical record. Leave it with Giles. It's already on your desk, she said. Something moved in his expression that was warmer than professional. Of course it is, he said. The chamber was bright from the windows. Outside the morning had opened clear, the first genuinely good day in a long grey run. After the authorization, he said, your status here changes, you'll be a Crown official. Formal position, formal salary, the Eastern Wing rooms can be permanent. I'll need a second board, she said, for the new cases. I'll arrange it. A pause. I'm settling you into the palace. You're providing appropriate facilities for a Crown official, she said. Yes, he said, and I'm settling you into the palace. She looked at him steadily. The ritual, she said, I'll keep it prepared, not because I expect to use it, because the choice being mine was what the whole thing was built on, and I need the option to remain available. Keep it prepared, he said. I don't want you to close it. She nodded once. She turned to go. Seraphine, he said. She stopped. The Eastern Wing rooms, the second board, the formal position. He paused. None of those things change what I said in the library about not asking. She turned back. She looked at him. I know, she said. Good, he said. She went. Outside the council chamber, the corridor was warm with morning light. She walked back to the Eastern Wing with the 7-5 vote and the 200 cases, and the authorization scheduled for next week, and the locked box in the top drawer of her desk, and the calculation she had been running for 11 years, and all of it, everything, the specific improbable weight of all of it, moving with her through the palace that was becoming her place to work, and possibly something more than that, which she was going to examine carefully and not in a hurry. She sat down at her desk. She opened the first of the new cases. She went to work. Lord Aldrich challenged the practitioner authorization in a speech that lasted 14 minutes and was, objectively, well constructed. He covered the legal precedent concern, the scope of authority question, the capacity question, the trust and accountability question, and finally the question of what standard would be applied to practitioners who lacked formal educational credentials. Seraphine sat at the witness table. She had notes she did not need. She had prepared for all 5 objections so many times that the responses were simply there, present and ready, the way things are ready when they have been maintained for long enough. When Aldrich finished, Kalin looked at her. She addressed the first 4 objections in order, briefly and precisely. The 5th she handled differently. The formal educational pathway, she said, does not exist for this field because the establishment that would have created it had significant financial incentive not to create it. The university suppressed the only formal research program in bond dissolution 30 years ago, and that suppression was not motivated by academic standards. It was motivated by the financial interests of the families who were using bond arrangements as property instruments. There is no formal pathway because the people who control the pathways did not want one created. Authorizing a practitioner who developed expertise outside that structure is not a failure of standards. It is the acknowledgement that the structure's failure to develop standards created the necessity for independent expertise, and that the independent expertise is real and documented, and the most complete body of knowledge in this field available anywhere in this kingdom. She paused. I have 14 years of documented practice, 42 completed cases, a research record that exceeds anything in this kingdom's institutional holdings, and the legal framework for this amendment that the Crown's own office has described in writing as the most thorough brief in this session. If the question is whether my credentials meet an appropriate standard, I am available to help develop that standard, because I know this field better than anyone in this room and several rooms beyond it. The chamber was quiet. Kalin called the vote. 8-5. Aldrich's 3-vote block held, but Martin voted for the authorization, and a second council member who had been sitting on the precise boundary of the Aldrich block for 2 months voted for it as well, and the authorization passed by 8-5. Kalin announced that the Crown Practitioner designation was hereby created, that Seraphine Voss held the first license, and that the Crown Practitioner's office would be established in the eastern wing of the palace, with immediate authority to process retroactive review cases under the amendment's provisions. Aldrich left without looking at her. Crest left with the specific expression of a man who has done the right thing for impure reasons, and is in the process of deciding how to feel about that. Lord Martin paused near her chair on his way out. He was 27, young for the council, and he had a face that showed its thinking without intending to. "My family has a case in the Southern Holdings from 17 years ago," he said. "I was 10 when it was arranged. I don't know if it falls within the retroactive review provision's scope." 17 years ago falls within scope, she said. "You can submit a formal inquiry through the Crown Practitioner's office anonymously if you prefer." "Yes," he said, "I would prefer that." "Then anonymously," she said. He nodded and left. She sat in the chamber alone for a moment after the last person had gone. 8-5. She had done this. 14 years of work and she had done this, and the 200 cases were now 240 based on the intake from the past week, and there were more coming, more that would come when the formal channel became familiar enough to feel safe, when the change in the law became real enough that people believed it. She thought about the building in the eastern quarter, the door with no number, the knock pattern, the long years of people arriving quietly because quiet was the only available method. She thought about a formal intake office with a crown seal on the door, and hours posted publicly, and no knock pattern required. She thought about Lena. She would tell him she had Lena's file tonight, she decided. The time for waiting was over. The amendment had passed and the authorization had passed, and they were past the immediate work and into the sustained work, and the sustained work had room for the other thing now. She gathered her documents, she left. In the palace kitchen corridor, walking toward the eastern wing, she passed a window that looked out over the inner garden. The garden was in full afternoon light, the paths clear and warm. Someone had planted something new in the bed near the east wall, small and bright, still establishing itself but obviously intending to grow. She looked at it for a moment. Then she went to her office and opened the next case. She worked until the lamps needed lighting, then she went to the library. The library was warm on the second floor. The books held their positions. The lamp at the east table was lit, which meant he had been there earlier or someone had anticipated her schedule, which amounted to the same thing. He was at the window when she arrived, his back to the room, looking out at the garden in the evening dark, with a quality of stillness that was different from his usual working stillness. She had been learning his stills the way she had learned the sounds of the palace, cataloging, identifying, placing them in their correct category. This one she had only seen twice before. It was the still of a man who is carrying something he has been carrying for a long time and is holding it differently tonight. She set down her files. She went to stand beside him at the window. The garden was dark. The paths were lit only by the moon and the lamplight from the corridors above. "Do you want to tell me about her?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "She liked fires," he said. "She said they were the only honest things in a house, that they burned until they were finished and then they were ash and the ash was as honest as the fire." Seraphine was still. "She said it in the east parlor at my family's estate," he said. "We were both young. It was winter and we were sitting by the fire and she was eating dried apricots that she had been eating since the morning and would not share under any circumstances. She said it very simply and then went back to the apricots." "She sounds specific," Seraphine said. "She was very specific," he said. "She had opinions about everything, very detailed opinions about very precise things. She had an opinion about the correct way to store dried fruit. She had an opinion about the angle at which shutters should be fixed. She had an opinion about the precise moment in autumn when it stops being warm and starts being cold, which she could identify to within 2 days of accuracy every year. Seraphine listened. She made everyone around her feel like the world was more specific than they had previously understood, he said. Like it had more texture, like there was more to notice if you paid the right kind of attention. That is a rare quality, Seraphine said. Yes, he said, it is. They stood at the window in the quiet. The file, Seraphine said. I'd like to give it to you, not tonight if you're not ready, but I want you to have it. He was quiet for a moment, then tonight. She nodded. She went to her bag and found the folder she had carried here, not the thick research file that was in her office. This was the case summary, the clinical document. The one that contained, in precise and documented language, what Lena's medical records had actually shown, and what Seraphine understood it to mean. She set it on the table between them. He picked it up, he looked at the cover, he did not open it immediately. Case 3, he said. Case 3, she confirmed. The case that established my understanding of the late-stage presentation, the one that made everything else possible technically. If I hadn't found her file, the framework would have taken several more years to build correctly. He opened it. She watched him read. She did not watch his face. She watched his hands, which were steady on the paper, and the quality of his breathing, which changed slightly at the 3rd page and then settled. He read for 10 minutes. He set it down. She came to you, he said. Technically, yes. I was conducting fieldwork. She didn't know what I was doing or why. She described her situation in the language of a person who has become clinical about something because the emotion is too costly to carry at full weight. She was very precise and very clear, and she told me everything I needed to know, and then she thanked me for listening and went home. He was quiet. She thanked you for listening, he said. She thanked everyone who listened, Seraphine said. It was what she had been reduced to, the gratitude for the basic acknowledgement. He set his hands flat on the table. I promised her, he said. Yes, Seraphine said. And the law is signed. The law is signed, she said, and the amendment is passed. And 240 people have cases in the formal process, and the system you built is working. He looked at the folder. Would she have liked you? Seraphine asked. He looked up. I think she would have asked you 6 questions before you finished explaining what you do, he said. And she would have told you 2 things you had already thought of and 1 thing you hadn't. I would have liked that, Seraphine said. Yes, he said, I think you would have. The library was very quiet. The books held their patience. The lamp made its circle of warmth between them. Keep the file, she said. It was always yours to have. He nodded. He held it for a moment longer. Then he set it beside his documents, which was where things went when they were going to come with him. The library tomorrow, he said. 8 o'clock, she said. She went to her room. She stood at the desk. She opened the top drawer. The locked box was there. She looked at it for a long moment. She thought about the Lena file and the way he had read it, and the dried apricots and the East parlor, and the way a specific 17-year-old had understood fires. She closed the drawer. She went to bed. In the morning, as always, there was work. The Crown Practitioner's office was established on the 3rd floor of the eastern wing, 2 rooms down from Seraphine's quarters, in a space that had previously been used for storage of documents that no one was entirely sure the function of. Harold, the intake coordinator, cleared the storage in 2 days and had the room equipped in another 3. Seraphine had given him a list. He had executed the list with an efficiency that told her he had worked in spaces like this before and understood what they needed. The desk was large. The filing system was the one she had told him about, the numerical cross-reference system she had developed over 6 years, and he had set it up correctly the first time without requiring clarification. She put the Crown Practitioner's seal on the wall herself. She had been handed it at the authorization vote by the Council Secretary, a small ceremony that the Council Secretary performed with the gravity of a man who understood what it meant even if the council around him was in the process of absorbing the outcome of the vote. She had taken it home. She had looked at it for a long time, and then she had put it on the wall where she could see it from the desk. The first case that came through the formal channel rather than through her existing referral network arrived on the 2nd day of the office's operation. a woman from the northern quarter of the city, who had heard about the formal intake from a neighbor who had heard about it from someone who had read the City Gazette's brief notice about the practitioner authorization. The chain of information had covered the distance from the official announcement to the northern quarter in approximately 4 days, which Seraphine noted as evidence that the formal channel was already more accessible than the eastern quarter building had been, even in the eastern quarter's best years. The woman was 37, she had been in her bond for 11 years, she had children. The situation was complicated in several dimensions, the way situations with children always were, because the dissolution of the bond affected not only the primary parties but the family structure around them, and the legal framework for that had been only partially addressed in the decree and the amendment, and was going to require additional work that Seraphine had already identified and was in the process of drafting a proposal for. She took the case carefully and thoroughly. She took the next case the same way and the next. By the end of the first week, the formal intake had received 16 new inquiries. By the end of the second, 41. By the end of the month, the number was over 100, and she had hired the first associate practitioner, a woman named Dara who had been a bond studies student before the field had been formalized, and who had in the 8 years since been doing what Seraphine had been doing, work that needed to be done, conducted carefully outside the legal framework that had not yet existed, with documentation that was now proving to be useful in ways neither of them had fully anticipated. Dara was 29 and careful, and had the specific quality of seriousness that good practitioners had, the quality of understanding that the people in the case files were people, not cases, and that everything you did in the file had consequence for the person's actual life. Seraphine had interviewed her for 2 hours before offering her the associate position. She had asked her 31 questions. Dara had answered 28 of them correctly and asked 3 questions of her own that Seraphine had thought were the right questions to ask. "Start Monday," Seraphine had said. "I'll start today," Dara had said. Seraphine had considered this for a moment. "Start today," she had confirmed. Dara had started that afternoon, which was a Thursday, and had immediately identified a cross-reference gap in one of the active cases that Seraphine had not caught. Seraphine had looked at the gap, confirmed that it was a gap, and made the correction. "Good catch," she said. "Thank you," Dara said. "Tell me when you see something I've missed," Seraphine said. "I've been doing this for 14 years and I still miss things. The cases matter more than my record." Dara had looked at her for a moment with the expression of a person who has just been told something they did not entirely expect to be told. Then she had nodded and gone back to the case she was reviewing. They worked well together. Seraphine had not expected to find someone she worked well with so quickly, and she allowed herself to note this as evidence that the formalization of the field was already producing results she had not fully anticipated. A legal framework created the conditions for people to come forward. People coming forward included practitioners who had been working in the shadows, as she had, and who now had somewhere to work in the light. The building in the eastern quarter continued to operate, now with a crown seal on the door and hours posted publicly, and Mrs. Cornett's office managing the administrative connection between it and the palace intake. The knock pattern was gone. The cases that came through the eastern quarter door now went through the same formal process as the cases that came through the palace intake and were documented in the same way and received the same quality of attention. This was the point. This was what standardization meant. Not that every case was the same, they were never the same, but that every case was treated as if it mattered equally, as if the person inside it deserved the same rigor regardless of how they had found the door. She went to Lena's grave one afternoon in the second month of the office's operation, not because she had planned to. She had been walking in a part of the city she was not often in, following up on a cross-reference that required a document from the city archive in that district, and she had passed the entrance to the churchyard where she knew from the file that Lena was buried. She had stopped at the gate for a moment, then she had gone in. She found the stone without much difficulty. It was a simple marker with Lena's name and dates and nothing else. The stone was clean, someone maintained it. She stood in front of it for a moment. "Case 3, she said, which was inadequate but was accurate. She did not say, "I'm sorry." She was not sorry in the sense of having done something wrong. She was sorry in the older sense, the sense of grief at what was wrong in the world. She had been sorry about this for 11 years, and the sorry did not get smaller with time. It changed shape. It became the thing that moved her forward rather than the thing that held her in place. The amendment passed 7-5, she said. 140 active cases as of this morning. The first associate practitioner started last month. I'm training 2 more. She paused. He thinks of you often, she said. He told me about the dried apricots. The churchyard was very quiet around her. The afternoon light was the long gold of autumn, the kind that made the old stones look as though they had been placed there by people who intended them to last, and they had. She stood for a few more minutes, then she went back to the city archive. She got the document, she completed the cross-reference. She went back to the palace and opened the next case. The audit on Lord Fenn's land holdings was conducted by the Crown's legal office over the course of 6 weeks, which was fast by the legal office's standard, and exactly what Seraphine had expected given the quality of the documentation she had provided. She had not provided partial documentation. She had provided complete documentation, organized in the precise order that would allow the auditors to move through the cases without needing to retrace their steps, with the cross-reference annotations built into the file structure, so that the connection between the bond arrangements and the land transfers was not something that needed to be inferred. It was laid out, link by link, in a sequence that anyone could follow. This was not an accident. It was a choice she had made at the beginning of her practice and had maintained through 42 cases. Document in a way that makes the truth the path of least resistance. Make it easier to understand what happened than to misunderstand it. In the 6 weeks of the audit, several things happened that were related to it and several that were not, but that changed the landscape around it. Lord Aldrich filed a formal protest with the Crown Secretary's office challenging the broadened scope of the inquiry that had allowed Seraphine to present the full cross-reference documentation. The protest argued that Kaelin's use of the presiding authority provision to expand an inquiry beyond its filed scope was procedurally irregular. The Crown Legal Office reviewed the protest and found it without merit. Aldrich appealed the finding. The appeal was reviewed and found without merit. Aldrich filed a secondary protest challenging the validity of the Crown-authorized archive access that had allowed Seraphine to access the land transfer records. The secondary protest was reviewed and found without merit. Seraphine tracked all 3 filings through Giles, who had established a routine of leaving her relevant counsel business on her desk in the mornings. She read each protest, identified the specific legal arguments, noted the points of genuine procedural weakness in the Crown's responses, and left brief memos in response for Kaelin's legal office indicating how those weaknesses could be addressed. The legal office sent her a note after the 3rd memo. It said, "Thank you, this is useful. How are you doing this while also running 240 active cases?" She wrote back, "Practice." 240 active cases were moving through the review process at a rate that was faster than she had projected, which told her that the subjects were well prepared to document their cases. They had been waiting for this framework for a long time in many instances, and they had their records in order. She had not anticipated that. She had modeled for the cases where the subject would need extensive support gathering documentation, and those cases existed, but they were fewer than she had projected. People who had been living inside unjust systems for years had often, she was finding, been quietly compiling the evidence that the system would not formally accept. They had the records, they simply had not had anywhere to send them. She adjusted her capacity projections upward. Lord Fenn's son Edward came to the formal intake office in the 3rd week of the audit. He came under his own name, which surprised her, because she had expected him to use the anonymous provision. He sat across from her at the formal desk in the formal office with the Crown seal on the wall, and he was the same as he had been in the Eastern Quarter, careful, quiet, with the stillness of a person who has made a difficult decision, and is now executing it without the luxury of second-guessing. "I came under my own name," he said, "because I'm going to give a statement to the audit office this week, and I thought it should be consistent." She looked at him. "What kind of statement?" she said. "The audit office asked if I had information about the bond arrangements connected to the Western Holdings transfers," he said. "I have information." "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm going to do it anyway." She sat with that for a moment. He was 23 years old. He had spent 3 years understanding what his father had built, and 2 of those years deciding what to do about it, and 1 month doing it. "The statement will become part of the formal record," she said. "It will be associated with your name permanently." "I know," he said again. "It will complicate certain things for you. The land portfolio, the family position, The professional relationships your father built that you may have expected to inherit. Yes, he said. I understand that. And she said, and I've been carrying the knowledge of what he did for 3 years, he said. The carrying is worse than the complication. She nodded once. The audit office is in the south wing, she said. The coordinator is a woman named Mrs. Dale. She is thorough and she is discreet. Tell her I sent you. Thank you, he said. Do you need anything else from this office before you go? No, he said. I think I have everything I need. He left. She sat at the desk for a moment after the door closed. She thought about 19 years old in a rented room deciding to do the right thing regardless of what it cost. She thought about the specific weight of that decision repeated across different people in different rooms in different years. She picked up the next case file. The audit concluded on a Wednesday morning, 6 weeks and 2 days after it had begun. The findings were precise and comprehensive. 312 specific instances of land transfer facilitated by bond arrangements over 22 years, of which 247 met the evidentiary standard for reversal under the retroactive review provision. The financial implications for the Fenn family's land portfolio were significant. The report was delivered to Fenn's legal representative at 9 in the morning. By 2 in the afternoon, Lord Fenn had submitted his formal resignation from the council. Seraphine was reviewing a case file when Giles brought the news. She read the confirmation twice. She put it in the Fenn folder, which was now thicker than any individual case file she maintained. She picked up the next case. She did not feel satisfied exactly. She felt the specific quality of a thing correctly concluded, the response you give when a long calculation finally returns a clean result. It was not happiness. Happiness was for things that arrived unexpectedly. This was the result she had been building toward. She thought about the university, the department head's expression, the walk out of the building with the journals in her coat. She thought about the first rented room and the first case and the 42nd case and the knock pattern that was no longer necessary. Fenn had believed that suppressing her thesis would prevent the field from developing. He had been wrong by approximately 14 years and 400 cases. She closed the Fenn folder. She started the next file. At 4 in the afternoon, Kaelin appeared in her doorway. Fenn's resignation, he said. I heard, she said. The council seat needs to be filled. I have a shortlist. The shortlist Giles left on my desk this morning, she said. I've made notes on 3 of the candidates. He came in. He looked at the 2 boards which were both fully covered now, the second one added 3 weeks ago and already at capacity. He looked at the timeline she had added along the top of the first board, which tracked the audit, the authorization, the ongoing review cases, and the projected schedule for the Southern Province extension. 280 active cases, she said, not counting the ones that have been completed. The system is working, he said. The system is working, she agreed. I want to extend the intake to the southern provinces. There are 60 documented cases in treaty territory that fall outside our current jurisdiction. If the Crown extends its review authority through the treaty provisions. I read the proposal you left on my desk, he said. 16 pages, she said. The treaty extension argument is in sections 2 and 4. The approach sequence for which treaty partners to contact first is in the appendix. He looked at her 4-page appendix. Yes, she said. You wrote a 4-page appendix. The sequencing matters, she said. Approaching the Eastern partners first gives us precedent for the Western negotiations. The order is not arbitrary. I know, he said. I read the appendix. A pause. Draft the council presentation. It's on your desk, she said. I left it this morning. He found it on the desk without looking because he had learned what her work looked like. He opened it. He read the first page. This is good, he said. I know, she said. He looked up. The corner of his mouth moved. You're very certain of your own work, he said. I have 14 years of evidence that my judgments are accurate, she said. I'm certain accordingly. Is that true of everything you judge? She looked at him directly. Most things, she said. The things I'm less certain of I check more times. And what is it that you're checking more times currently? The afternoon light came through the window at a low angle, the kind that made everything in the room seem slightly more present than usual. shadows more defined, colors more themselves. The calculation, she said, the one I've been running since I was 19. And the current result, he said. She looked at him. It's converging, she said. Toward something very clear, she said. I expect another few months before I'm satisfied with the confidence interval. He looked at her for a long moment. A few months, he said. The calculation requires data that can only be gathered from sustained proximity, she said. I need time. Take the time you need, he said. I intend to, she said. He picked up the council presentation from her desk. Library tonight, he said. 8 o'clock, she said. He left. She sat at the desk with the 280 cases, and the boards, and the sunset coming through the window. She thought about a few months. She thought about the locked box. She went back to work. The months moved in the way that months move when you are inside a sustained period of work, not slowly, not quickly, but with the specific rhythm of time that is being used rather than spent. The treaty extension vote passed 9-4, as Seraphine had projected. The first Eastern Partnership Agreement was signed within a week. The 60 documented cases in treaty territory became 83 once the formal intake opened in those regions, because people who had been waiting in silence for a structure to trust were ready when the structure arrived. The associate practitioners she had been training moved their first cases through the review process. The first 3 were supervised. The next 7 were reviewed after completion. The ones after that were handled independently, with Seraphine available for consultation on anything that presented a complication the practitioner had not encountered before. There were always complications she had not fully anticipated. This did not concern her. Complications were the normal condition of work in a field that dealt with human beings, who were reliable in their need for care and entirely unpredictable in the specific forms that need took. Aldrich resigned in the 3rd month. He did not do it the way Fenn had done it, quickly, definitively, in response to a specific auditable finding. He did it in the way of a man who has spent 3 months trying to find a workable angle and has finally accepted that no workable angle exists and that continuing to look for one is costing him more than stopping wood. He submitted his resignation letter to the council's secretary on a Tuesday morning and was out of the building by noon. Seraphine received the news from Giles in the afternoon. She read it, she filed it, she went back to her case. That evening in the library, she told Kalen about it. I know, he said, Giles told me this morning. Before you came to the office this afternoon, she said. Yes, you didn't mention it. You were in the middle of a complex case documentation, he said. It didn't seem like the moment. She looked at him. You've learned when not to interrupt my work, she said. I've been paying attention, he said. The library was quiet around them. The lamp between them was steady. Outside the window, the first autumn rain was beginning, a gentle kind rather than the hard accusatory kind, the kind that softened things rather than struck them. It's been 4 months, he said. She had been waiting for this. She had known it was coming without knowing exactly when, because he was a man who waited until something was the correct time, and then said it precisely at that time. Yes, she said. The calculation, he said. You said a few months. Yes, she said. And she set down her pen. She looked at her hands for a moment, which were still from the evening's writing, resting flat on the notebook she had been keeping since her 3rd year of practice, and that was nearly full. The calculation has converged, she said. He was quiet. The confidence interval is as narrow as I can make it, she said. I've checked it 3 times in the past 2 weeks. The result is stable. And the result is, he said. She looked up at him. The lamp made the room warm between them, the books patient on their shelves, the autumn rain against the windows making its quiet, continuous sound. That what is in this room is not only what the bond built, she said. The bond built something real. I'm not going to pretend it didn't. It is a biological mechanism, and it functions whether I want it to or not, and it has been functioning in this room since the intake office 4 months ago. She paused. But the calculation required me to separate what the bond built from what the rest of it built, she said. What 6 years of watching someone do something that mattered built. What 4 months of being in the same building as a person who is careful with language and reads counterarguments before making decisions, and walked into a petition intake office because he simply walked there, what that built. He was absolutely still. I ran the model on the counterfactual, she said, the version where the diagnostic had never happened, where I had encountered your work only through professional channels, where none of the rest of it had been part of the picture. And, he said, and the model returns the same direction, she said. I can't know with certainty it's a model, not a proof, and the counterfactual is inherently hypothetical. But the weight of evidence is clear. What does the model say, he said, about what you would do in the counterfactual, having encountered my work through professional channels? She looked at him. It says I would be in this library, she said, working with you, and that the direction of things would be the same. The room was very quiet. The rain was a soft, continuous presence against the glass. The ritual, he said, it's still prepared. Yes, she said, it will remain prepared. I know, he said, I know why. The choice being mine, she said. The choice being yours, he agreed. And I would not have it any other way. You built 14 years of your life on the principle that choice matters. I built 17 years of law on the same principle. I would not be the person who took that from you. She looked at him for a long time. I made the choice this morning, she said. Before I opened the first case file, I checked the drawer and I looked at the box and I made the choice to be here today. And tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow morning I will check the drawer again, she said, and I will make the choice again. Yes, he said, I know. He reached across the table, not quickly, deliberately, and set his hand on the table near hers, not taking it, not making a claim, simply placing his hand near hers in the specific way that means I am here and I am not going anywhere and nothing about that depends on you doing anything in response. She looked at his hand, she looked at hers. She turned her hand over. His fingers were warm against her palm. They sat in the library until the lamps burned low and the autumn rain eased, and the night went through its full range from dark to darker to the specific deep blue that precedes dawn. They talked some. They worked some. They were quiet in the way of people who have passed through the necessity of managing each other's impressions and can simply be inside the same space. At some point she said, "You could have said something sooner." And he said, "You needed the time to run the calculation correctly." And she said, "Yes." And that was all of that. In the morning she went to her room, she opened the top drawer, she looked at the locked box. She made the choice. She closed the drawer. She opened the first case file of the day. She went to work. In the weeks that followed, the library at 8 o'clock became a thing that happened the way other regular things happened in the palace, not by formal arrangement, not by explicit agreement, simply by the mutual understanding of two people whose schedules had aligned around something and who saw no reason to realign them. They worked on separate things at the same table. Sometimes they talked about the cases, about the council, about the treaty extension and the Southern Province inquiry and the new practitioner candidates, and the framework that would need to look different in 3 years to remain functional as the volume grew. Sometimes they worked in the quiet that needed nothing added to it. Kaelan continued to read everything she put on his desk, which she knew because he continued to ask questions that could only be asked by someone who had read it completely. She continued to put things on his desk before he asked for them, which he had stopped commenting on in the sense of expressing surprise, and had started accepting as the operating condition of working with her. She liked being understood, she discovered. She had not expected to. She had operated for so long in spaces where understanding herself was the thing she gave to others, not a thing she received, that she had made her peace with the asymmetry without fully realizing that peace had been required. The discovery that it was not the only available condition was something she examined carefully and without hurry. She was deliberately not hurrying anything. She had spent 11 years not hurrying this. She was not going to rush it now because the calculation had concluded. In the 4th month after the library evening, she was working late on a case involving a family in the Northern Territories whose documentation had a 3-year gap in the middle that required cross-referencing with provincial court records that existed in a form that was technically accessible but practically difficult. She was deep in the cross-reference when Kaelan came in. She did not look up. "You've been in here since 6, he said. The Northern Territories case has a gap, she said. The provincial court records are filed by quarter rather than by case. I'm working through the relevant quarters. How many quarters? 12, she said, 3 years. He sat down, he looked at the court record she was working from. The gap begins in the second quarter of year 12, he said. She looked at the record, she looked at the notation. Yes, she said. The provincial court restructured their filing system in year 12, he said. The cases from the transition period were refiled under a different classification code. The relevant records would be under the case type classification rather than the date classification. She looked at him. How do you know that? I was a junior council member when the restructuring was ordered, he said. I spent 3 months trying to find a case from the transition period and eventually had to call the provincial court directly. She looked at the record. She looked at the classification header. She checked the notation. The gap was a filing system reclassification. She had just found 3 hours of work in 30 seconds. Thank you, she said. You would have found it, he said, eventually. At some point after midnight, she said. Yes, he said, which is why I came to find you when the kitchen staff told me you hadn't come for dinner. She looked up. The kitchen staff told you. They keep track of who comes for meals, he said. They are more attentive than you might expect. They are reporting to you about my meal habits, she said. They mentioned it in passing, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved in her chest that was entirely in the category of real, of her own, of nothing to do with fate magic, and everything to do with a man who checked whether she had come for dinner. The case is in better shape than I thought, she said. I can finish the cross-reference tomorrow. Then come have dinner, he said. She closed the case file. She stood. The Northern Territories has a very complex court restructuring history, she said, as they went out of the office into the corridor. Yes, he said. I'm going to need the full filing history for the transition period to handle similar gaps in future cases. I'll have the provincial court send the complete documentation, he said. Thank you, she said. They walked down the corridor toward the palace's central rooms, where dinner would be available in the smaller of the 2 dining halls that the staff maintained for late evenings when the formal dining room wasn't opened. The corridor was warm and the lamps were lit, and the palace was quiet in the late evening way it was always quiet when the official business had concluded, and the building had settled into being a place where people lived rather than a place where decisions were made. She looked at the corridor, she looked at the lamps, she thought about what she had told him in the library about the model and the counterfactual and the direction of things. It's the same, she said. What is, he said. The result of the model, she said. I ran it again this afternoon. The gap case was distracting me and I ran it as a reset exercise. The result is the same. He was quiet for a moment. You run it regularly, he said. Yes, she said, not to check whether I still feel the same, to practice maintaining the distinction between what the bond builds and what the rest builds. It's useful to keep the distinction clear. And the 2 things are distinct, he said. Yes, she said, they feel different. The bond pull is a specific sensation. I could identify it in a diagnostic. What the rest of it feels like is something else. Something that doesn't have a technical name in my research because I never wrote about my own experience. What does it feel like, he said. She thought about this. She was a person who used precise language because she respected the subject she was describing and did not want to approximate it. Like the world being more specific than I previously understood it to be, she said. Like there being more to notice if I pay the right kind of attention. He stopped walking. She stopped. He was looking at her, something in his expression she had not seen before, or had seen and not had a category for until now. Something that lived below the professional, below the careful, below all the things he had built over 17 years to hold the things that needed holding. That is what I said about Lena, he said, when I described her to you. Yes, she said. You used the same language. Yes, she said. I noticed that you used the same language to describe her and to describe your experience of. Yes, she said, I noticed it when I said it. I considered not saying it. I decided to say it anyway. He looked at her. Because, he said. Because it was accurate, she said, and I said a long time ago that I was going to be honest about all of it. The corridor was quiet, the lamps were steady. Somewhere in the building, a door closed and someone's footsteps went away from them down a distant hall. "Dinner," she said. "Yes," he said. "Dinner." They walked the rest of the corridor and ate in the small dining hall and talked about the Northern Territories case filing system and the treaty extension and the council seat that was still being debated, and all of it was ordinary and specific and exactly what it was. The morning after the library evening in autumn, when the rain was soft and his hand was warm and the calculation had finally completed, she went to her room and stood at the desk and opened the top drawer. The locked box was there. She looked at it for a long time. Then she picked it up, she set it on the desk in front of her, she unlocked it. Inside were the components of the dissolution ritual she had been carrying since before she came to this palace, arranged in the precise order of their use. The materials were clean, maintained in perfect condition. She had checked them monthly, then weekly, then daily as she moved closer to the center of things. They were as ready as they had ever been. She stood at the desk and looked at the components. She thought about what she had said in the library and what it meant to have said it. She thought about the calculation and the model and the 11 years of careful, precise work that had brought her to this specific desk, in this specific palace, standing over this specific box. She thought about the choice. The choice was hers. She had built her entire life on that principle. She was not going to abandon it now, not when it was most real, not when it was most easy to abandon, because the thing she was choosing was the thing she wanted. That was when the principle was most important, when the choice was easy to want and hardest to verify. She looked at the components for a long time. Then she picked up one of the primary materials, a pressed herb bundle precisely dried, the one that would be the first element placed in any working of this ritual, and she held it for a moment, not activating it, just holding it. And then she set it back. She closed the box. She locked it. She put it back in the drawer. She sat down at the desk, and she was very still for a moment. What she understood, having gone all the way to the edge of the choice and looked over it clearly and come back, was that the calculation had been right. The result was not the bond. The bond was in the room and it was real and she acknowledged it completely. But what she had built toward this man over 6 years of watching his work and 4 months of being inside the same building and one dinner in the small dining hall where they talked about court filing systems, that was its own thing. It lived in its own register. It had its own weight. She was not choosing him because the bond chose him. She was choosing him because she had done the work and looked at it clearly, and the work said, "This is real." The box stayed in the drawer. She opened the first case file. She went to work. She did not tell him what she had done, not that morning, not that week. It was not the kind of thing that required a report. The choice was hers, and the evidence of the choice was not the locked box in the drawer or the ritual prepared or anything that pointed outward. The evidence of the choice was that every morning she came to her desk, and the drawer stayed closed, and she opened the case files and she picked up her pen. She had told him the choice would be daily. She was keeping the promise. In the second week after the library evening, she came to the library at 8 o'clock to find him already there and a second cup of tea on the table at her usual place, which was the kind of thing that required no comment and received none. She sat down. She picked up the tea. She opened the case file she had brought. They worked in the quiet. At some point, 10 o'clock perhaps, the city outside the window gone dark and the lamps making their warm circles, he set down his pen and looked at the window for a moment and said, "When Lena was well before the bond, she used to argue about everything." Seraphine looked up. "Not combatively," he said. "She just had strong positions on most things and she was interested in testing them. She would take a position and then she would present the counterargument herself just to see how it held up. She drove the adults completely out of patience. She was very thorough." "How old was she when you remember this?" Seraphine said. 16, 17. She was doing it until she did it for a long time." A brief pause. "I think she would have found your approach to counterarguments very congenial." Seraphine looked at him. "You write the counterargument to your own provisions before anyone else does," he said. She would have seen that as the correct way to do things. She would have been very interested in your methodology. She sounds like she would have been very thorough, Seraphine said. She would have read everything you've ever written, he said, and she would have had opinions about all of it. I would have welcomed that, Seraphine said. I know, he said, that's why I'm telling you. The library was very warm. The rain had started again outside, the autumn kind, steady and patient. She thought about the drawer and the box and the choice she had made, and the choice she would make again tomorrow, and she thought about the specific quality of a man who told her things about his dead cousin, because he believed she deserved to know the person whose loss had built everything they were doing together. She thought about the calculation's result. She was sure. I need to tell you something, she said. He looked at her. The morning after the library, she said. The evening when we sat by the window and I told you the calculation had converged. Yes, he said. In the morning I opened the box, she said. He was very still. I took out the components, she said. I held one of them, not activating it, holding it, being fully present with the choice. Being certain that what I was doing next was what I was choosing to do. She paused. And then I put it back, she said, and I closed the box, and I locked it, and I put it back in the drawer. The room was very quiet. I'm telling you this, she said, because you deserve to know that I have been to the edge of the choice and looked at it clearly and come back, not because the bond prevented me from doing otherwise, because the calculation said, this is real, and when the calculation says something clearly and I have checked it 3 times, I trust it. He was looking at her with something in his expression that she did not have a research category for, something she was going to need to build a category for. The box is still in the drawer, he said. Yes, she said. It will stay there, not as a threat, as the guarantee that the choice was real when I made it and will be real when I make it tomorrow. He nodded once, the way he nodded when he had absorbed something completely and had placed it where it belonged. I went to her grave last month, he said. She waited. I told her about you, he said. I told her about the research in the cases and the decree and the amendment. I told her about the file. A pause. I told her that the person who found her file had been carrying it carefully for 11 years and had brought it to me when the time was right. Seraphine was very still. I told her that the law was signed, he said, and that 4 months later I was sitting in the library with the person who helped make it real, and that she would have had very specific opinions about her. He paused, and that I thought she would have approved, he said, not because she would have been easy about it. She would have asked you questions for 3 days and found everything she thought was a gap in your methodology and argued about it in the specific way she had, but at the end of it she would have approved. Seraphine breathed. I think that might be the kindest thing anyone has ever said to me, she said. It's accurate, he said. Accuracy was important to her. To her and to me, Seraphine said. Yes, he said, I noticed. They went back to work. Not immediately. There were a few moments more of the library and the rain and the specific quality of having said the true things and having nowhere left to hide them. And then, gradually, the way 2 people who are also working people return to work even in the middle of something that matters. They return to the files on the table and the pens in their hands and the cases that needed completing. At midnight, she gathered her things. The box stays in the drawer, he said, not a question. The box stays in the drawer, she said. I'll see you tomorrow, he said. At 8 o'clock, she said. She went to her room. She did not open the drawer. She did not need to. She knew what was in it, and she knew where it was, and she knew, with the specific clarity of a calculation that has been checked and verified and settled, that she was going to know that every morning. She went to bed. In the morning she opened the drawer, she looked at the box, she made the choice. She closed the drawer. She opened the first case file. Good morning, she thought, at no one in particular and at someone specific simultaneously. She picked up her pen. The letters from the Eastern Territory started on the 4th day. Seraphine had said she would write. She had not said how frequently, which was her first indication that she had not fully calibrated what she intended when she said it. 4 days into the Eastern Partnership Territory, standing in the consultation room of the regional practitioner's office she had set up in the first treaty city, with the first 3 cases documented, and 2 more scheduled for the following morning. She found herself at the end of the day with the specific quality of a day's work completed and the desire to tell someone about it. She sat down, she took out paper. The first letter was 2 pages. It described the regional filing system in the treaty territory, which was organized completely differently from the northern kingdoms, and which had required her to spend the first 2 days building a translation framework between the two before any case processing could begin. It described the first 3 subjects, carefully without names, with the kind of professional shorthand that preserved the essential quality of each situation without the identifying details. It described the regional practitioners she had met, 2 of whom were immediately useful, and 1 of whom was going to require significantly more training before she could be trusted to process cases independently. At the bottom of the second page, in a paragraph that was slightly different from the rest of the letter in a way she only noticed after she had written it, she described the quality of light in the treaty city in the late afternoon, which was golden and came from a particular angle she had not encountered in the northern city, and which made the stone buildings look like they were lit from inside. She read through the letter when it was finished. She noted the paragraph at the bottom. She considered removing it. She left it in. The letter that came back 4 days later was 3 pages. The first 2 pages covered the new council appointment, the ongoing cases at the palace intake, a development in the Southern Province treaty negotiation that required her opinion on a specific procedural question, and a summary of Dara's performance on the 3 cases she had handled independently in Seraphine's absence, which was detailed and precise, and suggested that Kaelin had been paying attention to Dara's work in a way that went beyond what simple administrative oversight required. The third page began with a sentence that said, "The morning reports came from the eastern quarters this week, with a note that the intake there has had its best month since the formal channel opened. Harold attributes this to the signage change you approved before you left." It continued for a paragraph and a half with other palace business, and then at the end, in a paragraph that was slightly different from the rest of the letter in a way she recognized because she had produced the same thing 4 days earlier, it described the inner garden in what had apparently been an early frost, the plants that had survived it and the ones that hadn't, and the specific quality of the morning after a frost when everything that remains is sharper than it was before. She read the third page twice. She wrote back that evening. The correspondence settled into a rhythm over the following weeks that was unlike any correspondence she had conducted before. She was a professional writer of documents. She had been writing case files and research notes and legal arguments for 14 years, and she understood how to write precisely and efficiently for professional purposes. This was not that. This was a different kind of precision, the precision of a person learning to describe the texture of a day to someone who was not present in it, finding the words for things that did not normally require words because the other person could simply see them. The late frost on the treaty city's rooftops. The way the treaty region's bond practitioners had a different vocabulary for what they were working with, a vocabulary that revealed something about how differently the practice had developed in a different cultural context, which was professionally interesting and also personally interesting because she had been working from a single cultural reference for 14 years, and the encounter with the other one was opening things in her thinking that she had not expected. He wrote back about the council, about the inner garden, about a book he had found in the palace library that contained a brief reference to a bond dissolution practice from 400 years ago that she would want to read when she came back. About a conversation he had with Lord Martin that had been, against his expectations, genuinely useful. About the morning he had walked down to the petition intake office because there was a question about a case categorization, and had stood in the doorway of the intake room for a moment, remembering the first time he had walked into that room, which had not been a walk motivated by administrative necessity. She read that last part 3 times. She wrote back, "I know, I could tell." The next letter said, "I know you could tell, that bothered me for approximately a week." She wrote, and then. He wrote, and then I decided it was information rather than a complication. She sat with that letter for a long time in the consultation room of the Treaty City office, the afternoon light doing its particular thing to the stone outside the window, and she thought about a man who had described his own loss of control in the intake office and his processing of it and his conclusion about it in 4 sentences, all of which were accurate and precise and completely him. She wrote back a paragraph about the regional vocabulary for bonds and another paragraph about the second associate practitioner she had identified in the treaty territory, who was going to be excellent, and then a sentence at the end that said, "I'm coming home in a week." The cases are at the stage where the regional associate can manage the next phase independently. The letter that came back said, "Good, I've cleared the library at 8 o'clock." She was smiling when she packed the letter away. She was still smiling on the journey home, on the 3-day road through the Eastern Territories, past the village where she had spent 2 years in her early practice and the market town where the second rented room had been, and the outer city districts that she had first seen 14 years ago, when she arrived here not knowing yet how long she would stay. She arrived at the palace on a Thursday afternoon. Giles met her at the gate, which was not standard and which was therefore information. "His Majesty asked me to let him know when you arrived," Giles said. "Tell him I'm going to review the week's case files first," she said. "The library at 8. Giles nodded. "Welcome back, Crown Practitioner," he said. "Thank you, Giles," she said. She went to her office. She reviewed the case files. Dara had done excellent work. The intake numbers were up from her projections. Harold had implemented 2 process improvements that she read about in his written notes and that she thought were correct and that she had not suggested, which meant Harold was now running his own program improvements, which was exactly what she had hoped for when she told him his intake system was better than hers. She was pleased. She noted the pleasing. She went back to the files. At 8 o'clock she went to the library. The night she came back from the Eastern Territory and came to the library at 8 o'clock had a quality she had not anticipated, which was the quality of a thing that had been established in absence and was now being re-established in presence, and the difference between those 2 states was larger than she had expected. She had been in the Eastern Territory for 4 weeks. She had been writing letters for 4 weeks. She had maintained the relationship in the way things are maintained across distance, imperfectly in pieces, with the necessary simplifications of a format that requires you to choose what to include rather than being able to simply be present. She had known the letters were imperfect. She had valued them anyway. Being in the library was different from the letters. He was already at the east table when she came in. The lamp was lit at her usual place. He looked up when she came through the door. He did not say anything immediately, just looked at her in the way she had come to know meant he was updating his picture of her against the reality, which was a thing she thought she might do to him as well, after 4 weeks of only the letters. "The second associate practitioner in the treaty territory," she said, sitting down. "Her name is Petra. She's 32. She was running a documentation service for the regional courts that had a bond case component she had developed over 4 years on her own initiative. The documentation methodology is slightly different from ours, but it's good. I think it's going to be useful for the treaty cases in ways our methodology isn't, because it was developed inside the regional context." "You're already thinking about incorporating it," he said. "I've been thinking about it since the second day," she said. "I wrote it up on the road back. It's on your desk." "Of course it is," he said. She looked at him, he looked at her. "The inner garden," she said, "after the frost." "Still recovering," he said. "The eastern bed has done better than the western. I'll show you tomorrow if you want to see it." "Yes," she said, "I'd like to see it." They opened their respective work. The library settled around them into the functional, comfortable silence that 4 weeks of absence had not changed. It had simply been in suspension, waiting for both of them to be present in the same room for it to resume. She found this remarkably pleasant. She noted the finding without spending more time on it than it deserved. She went to the case file she was reviewing. At 10 o'clock, without any particular preamble, she said, "The letters were good." He set down his pen. "Yes," he said, "they were. Better than I expected letters to be," she said. "I've written documents for 14 years. I wasn't certain I knew how to write letters." "You knew how," he said. "I knew how to describe the cases and the professional situation," she said. "The other parts I had to learn." "You learned quickly," he said. "I had a good correspondent," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the paragraph about the light in the treaty city. "Yes," she said. "That was the first thing that was different from a professional report," he said. "I read it and I thought, this is not the same kind of writing." "No," she said, "it wasn't." "I was glad you left it in," he said. "I considered removing it," she said. "I know," he said. "I could tell. The paragraph has the quality of something that stayed in despite being considered for removal. She looked at him. You can tell that from a paragraph. I can tell that from your paragraph, he said. I've been reading your work for over a year. I know the difference between something you include deliberately and something you include after consideration. She sat with that for a moment. The Frost paragraph, she said. Yes, he said, that was deliberate. I know, she said, I could tell. They looked at each other across the library table in the warmth of the lamp and the patience of the books, and then they both went back to work, and the hour that followed was the most comfortable hour she could remember spending in a room with another person, which was information she filed carefully and precisely in the part of the calculation that had already converged, but that she kept checking anyway, because checking was what the methodology required. At midnight she gathered her files. At the door she paused. I checked the drawer this morning, she said, the first morning back in my own room. He was very still. The result was the same, she said. The choice was the same. I'm glad, he said quietly. I know you are, she said. Good night. Good night, he said. She went to her room. She went to sleep. In the morning she checked the drawer again. The result was the same. She was not surprised. She had known it would be the same, but she checked it anyway because the checking was the point. She closed the drawer. She went to work. The 412th case was Lady Helen Crest. It was the last one not because it was the least important, but because it was the most contested, and contested cases required the most documentation, and the most documentation required the most time, and Seraphine had learned long ago that the thing she owed every case was the time it required, and not a day less. Helen Crest was 23 years old now, a year past her dissolution, living in the northern house her family owned, and managing its land affairs in a way that, according to the 2 letters she had sent the Crown Practitioner's office in the past year, she found considerably more interesting than anyone had expected her to. The dissolution had freed her to make that choice. The retroactive review of the land arrangement attached to her bond, the arrangement that Lord Crest had spent 8 months challenging through every available legal process, had recently concluded with a finding in her favor. The land came with her. Her father had contested this. Her father was going to continue contesting it for some time. She had written that she understood and was proceeding anyway. Seraphine had written back, good. The case file was 6 inches thick and had cross-references that connected it to 11 other cases in the formal record. Completing the documentation to the standard the Crown Practitioner's office maintained had taken 3 months of careful systematic work, conducted alongside 280 other active cases, using the same precision she had applied to every file from case 1 onward. On the morning of the case's formal closure, she signed the final page. She sealed the file with the Crown Practitioner's seal. She picked it up. She carried it through the palace to Kaelin's working office, which she had been to many times in the past year and which she knew as well as her own workspace. She knocked. She came in when he said to come in. He was at the desk. Giles was not present. The office was in its usual organized state, documents covering most of the desk surface, a book open to a page he had been reading, the particular arrangement of a room where thinking and working happened continuously and neither was ever truly finished. She set the file on the desk in front of him. 412, she said. He picked it up. He opened it to the final page. He read the closing documentation. He read the seal. He closed the file. He looked at her. Helen Crest, he said. Yes, the most contested legal history. It needed the most time. 3 months, he said. The documentation was complex, and the challenge record had to be fully incorporated to meet the review standard. Did you conduct it yourself? He said. I did, she said. The contested cases I still do personally. It's a matter of knowing the full history of the challenge record and being able to account for it in the documentation. It requires a specific kind of attention. Yes, he said, it does. He stood up. He came around the desk. He picked up the file again and held it for a moment. 412 cases of formally concluded formal record, the full weight of a year and a half of work in 6 inches of documented closure. What comes next? He said. The southern provinces, she said. 60 documented cases, more coming in now that the intake is formal. The treaty extension is working, but the processing framework in the treaty territories needs development. I've been training 2 additional practitioners specifically for the treaty work, but I'll need to be present for the first several cases personally. Which means travel, he said. Which means some travel, she said. The Eastern Partnership territory first. I've mapped the schedule. The projection is in the briefing document I left on your desk this morning. He looked at the desk. He found the document without looking particularly hard for it, which was not the result of any special skill but simply familiarity, a year and a half of knowing what her work looked like. 4 weeks in the Eastern Territory, he said, reading the schedule. 3 to 4, depending on how the first cases process. If the documentation framework translates cleanly from our jurisdiction, 3 weeks. If there are adaptation complexities, 4. And the palace cases. The 3 senior associate practitioners are ready to handle them independently. I'll be available by correspondence for anything that presents a complication. I'll review the week's filings every evening. Every evening, he said. I don't take evenings off from the work, she said. I take evenings off from the office. It's not the same thing. I know, he said. I wasn't suggesting otherwise. She looked at him. You were thinking about the library at 8 o'clock. I was thinking about the library at 8 o'clock, he confirmed. She was quiet for a moment. Then I'll write, she said. From the Eastern Territory, not official correspondence, the other kind. Something shifted in his expression. The kind of shift that was not about governance or policy or the formal work between them. Good, he said. And when I come back, she said, the library at 8 o'clock will be where it was. Yes, he said, it will be. She picked up the Helen Crest file. She had come to give it to him and she had given it, and the exchange was complete, but she stood there for another moment because 412 was not an abstract number, and the woman who had closed every one of those cases was standing in this office holding the last of them. We did this, she said. Not because it needed saying, because it was true and she had decided, a long time ago, to say true things when they presented themselves rather than letting them live only inside her. Yes, he said. We did. She set the file back on the desk. She left it there, where it could be filed, where it belonged in the formal record of a year and a half of work that had changed 412 lives in documented, specific, irreversible ways. She went to the door. Seraphine, he said. She turned. Lena would have wanted to read the complete case record, he said, every single file, and she would have had opinions about the documentation methodology. Seraphine smiled, not the small careful version, the full thing. She would have told me what was wrong with it, she said. She would have been thorough, he said. Yes, she said, she would have. She left. She walked down the palace corridor in the mid-morning light and thought about a woman who had been 21 when she died and 40 if she had lived, and who had liked fires for being honest, and had eaten dried apricots in the East Parlor in winter, and had had strong specific opinions about everything, and who had, in 2 years of suffering and 1 conversation with a 19-year-old stranger, built the foundation of everything that came after. Seraphine did not go back to her office immediately. She went to the inner garden, which was at its best in this season. Late in the year, the beds cleared for winter except for the things that wintered well, the paths clean and the light long and low and golden. She walked once around the paths. She did not hurry. She thought about 412 people. She thought about the files, each one a specific person with a specific name and a specific set of circumstances, and a specific version of the moment when they came forward, which was always difficult and always its own kind of courage. She thought about Case 3, Lena, who had not made it to the version of the world where there was somewhere to come forward to. She thought about what it meant to build a world that Lena had not been able to use, and to build it anyway for everyone who came after. It meant something very large that she did not have a word for, not satisfaction, not resolution, something that lived in the space where those words stopped being adequate. She walked back inside. She went to her office. She opened the first case of the Southern Province series. Her pen was in her hand, the file was open. The work was here and she knew how to do it, and she was going to do it correctly and with every piece of care it deserved. And in the top drawer of the desk, the locked box sat. She had checked it this morning. She would check it tomorrow morning. She would check it the morning after that. She had told him the choice was daily and she had meant it and she had been keeping it. The box would always be there. The choice would always be real. The morning check was not a burden. It was the proof to herself, to the principle, to the 14 years that had built the principle, that the thing she was choosing was chosen rather than fallen into, was wanted rather than unavoidable, was hers. She turned the first page of the Southern case file. She read the subject's description of the bond and its circumstances, and the length of time they had been inside it, and what they were asking for. She made a note. She made another note. She began the documentation process that she had begun 412 times before and that she knew, by now, in a way that was less like knowledge and more like the way hands know their own work. The treaty case was in the Eastern Territory, 3 weeks, possibly 4. She would write him from there, she had said, the other kind of letter. She had not written that kind before. She was a person who documented things, and it would be strange to document that kind of thing, she thought, and then she thought, no. It would not be strange at all. It would simply be a different kind of precision, the precision of a person saying what is true about the world they are living in. She was capable of that. She had been practicing that kind of precision for a long time. She turned another page. The case was complex. She could see the complexity beginning to emerge from the documentation, the layers that would require careful unpacking. Good. Complex cases were interesting. Complex cases required the full weight of 14 years of practice. She set her pen to the page. She went to work. Outside the office window, the palace grounds were quiet in the late morning. The inner garden caught the sun. A bird landed on the wall at the garden's edge and considered the space below it, and then flew somewhere else. Ordinary morning in the palace. Ordinary work in the practitioner's office. Ordinary drawer with its ordinary locked box, and the ordinary daily choice that meant everything because it was ordinary, because it was made in the regular morning light without ceremony or witness, just a woman at a desk opening a drawer and looking at a box and choosing. Choosing. She chose. She closed the drawer. She opened the next page of the case file. And on the other side of the palace, in an office where a man she had known for a year and a half was working through the briefing documents she had left on his desk, one of those documents mentioned that she would be away for 3 to 4 weeks and would write. And he read that line and read it again, and then he set the document down for a moment and looked at the courtyard window the way a person looks at a window when they are thinking about something that is not the window. And then he picked the document back up and continued reading. Because the work was here. Because the work was always here. Because the work was the thing they had both built their lives around, and the reason they were in the same building, and the reason 412 people had files with crown seals on them, and the reason the Southern Province cases were in the drawer, and the reason the treaty territory had a practitioner framework, and the reason the building in the Eastern Quarter had a sign on it now that anyone could read. And also because this was what they were, 2 people who worked, who kept working, who had built something out of their working and intended to keep building it whatever came next, in the specific shared way of people who have found another person who works the way they work and values what they value and can sit in the same library at 8 o'clock and get things done. It was more than that, of course. It was considerably more than that, but it was also exactly that, and the exactly that was not a small thing. It was the ground everything else stood on. The signing of the formal mate bond acknowledgement happened quietly, in the morning, in his working office, with Giles as the required witness and Mrs. Cornett from the council secretary's office as the second. Seraphine had known it was coming because she had designed the legal framework for it. Not this specific instance, not her own file, but the framework for how a formal mate bond acknowledgement worked under the revised bond statutes, which specified that such acknowledgements were voluntary, documented, and required the explicit consent of both parties expressed in writing before a witness. This was not a romantic document, it was a legal one. It said, these 2 people have chosen each other freely with full information about the alternatives, and the law recognizes that choice. She had written the framework 2 years ago. She had written it thinking about all the people who would use it someday. She had not been thinking about herself. She had not been able to entirely without the data she didn't have yet. Now she had the data. She signed her name below his on the formal acknowledgement form in the specific handwriting she used for official documents, clear and precise and legally legible. She had signed her name on case files and research documents, and formal applications and consultation records, and the retroactive review forms for 412 completed cases. This was a different kind of signing, not in the mechanics, the pen, the paper, the ink, but in the weight. She had chosen this, not the biology, not the fate magic thread. She had chosen it after 11 years of preparation and 4 months of proximity, and a calculation she had run until she was as certain as her methodology could make her, which was very certain, which was enough. She set down the pen. Kalen was looking at the document, then he looked at her. "For the record," she said, "the choice is still mine every morning." "For the record," he said, "I know." Giles signed his witness line with the neutral professional efficiency of a man who had been witnessing things for 11 years, and understood that his role was to be accurate rather than expressive. Mrs. Cornett signed hers and took the document for official filing and left the room. Giles followed with the skill he had perfected over a decade, making his exit so smooth that it registered as the room itself deciding to become more private. Seraphine and Kalen stood in the working office in the quiet of a thing completed. "That's formal," she said. "Yes," he said. "I want you to know," she said, "that the morning check is not going to change. The box stays in the drawer. The choice stays mine. The document doesn't change the daily practice." "I know," he said. "I wouldn't want it to." "I know you wouldn't," she said. "That's part of why the result of the calculation was what it was." He looked at her for a moment, something in his expression that she was still building her category for, that she thought she might spend a long time building the right words for, and that was fine. She was a person who built things carefully over long periods. She was good at that. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what specifically?" she said. "For coming here," he said, deliberately prepared, with the ritual and the calculation and the 11 years of being ready for the choice. "Thank you," she said. "For walking into the intake office." "I simply walked there," he said. "I know," she said, "that was the important part." She picked up her case files from where she had set them on the corner of his desk when she came in, because she had brought them because she had been on her way to the library. "Library tonight," she said. 8 o'clock, he said. 8 o'clock, she confirmed. She went to the library. She worked. At 8 o'clock he came in and sat down one seat to the side, and they worked in the comfortable functional silence for 3 hours, and then she went to her room. She opened the top drawer. She looked at the locked box. She made the choice. She closed the drawer. She got into bed. In the morning she would open the drawer again. In the morning she would choose again. That was the shape of it. That was the form the thing had taken and would keep taking, not because she had designed it that way, but because it was the form that fit both of them. Two people who had spent their adult lives building things carefully, who understood that the important things were maintained by daily work rather than by grand gestures. Who had found each other at the intersection of a law and a 14-year preparation, and a morning when a man had simply walked to the wrong floor, because the part of him that knew where it was going had known where it was going even when the rest of him was still catching up. She lay in the dark of her room and thought about 412 cases, and the southern provinces, and the Eastern Territory, and the letters, and the library, and the morning check, and the calculation, and Lena, who had liked fires and the dried apricots, and a 17-year-old saying things that were very wise. She thought, this is what it looks like when it works, when the thing you built for the world also turns out to be the thing the world built for you. She went to sleep. In the morning, she opened the drawer. In the years that followed, and there were many years, the kind that accumulate without drama, built out of the ordinary daily material of work and the library at 8 o'clock, and the morning check and the drawer and the box inside it, and the choice, Seraphine never stopped checking the drawer. Not once. Not on the difficult days when a case came through the intake that was particularly hard to sit with, where the documentation of what had been done to someone made her very still at her desk for a long time before she could pick up the pen. Not on the days when the counsel was resistant and the legal battles were slow, and the results she expected took twice as long as they should have to arrive. Not on the days when she was in the Eastern Territory or the Southern Provinces, or the 2 weeks she spent in the Western Kingdoms, as part of an exchange with a bond practitioner there whose methodology she had been corresponding with for 2 years and wanted to see in practice. Every morning, every single morning, the drawer. The box. The choice. She had tried at some point in the third year to articulate to herself why she kept doing it, why she had not let the morning check become a rote thing, a habit performed without attention, the kind of ritual that loses its content through repetition. She had sat at her desk one morning with the drawer open and the box in front of her and had asked herself, "Do you still need to do this? Has the choice not been made already, permanently, in the library and the formal acknowledgement, and the 4 years of the library at 8 o'clock?" And the answer she had come to was, the choice is not a thing you make once. The choice is a practice. The choice is the ongoing activity of understanding what you are doing and why, not the single moment of decision, but the 1,000 mornings after it when you confirm that the decision still holds and is still yours and still reflects what you actually want rather than what you wanted before things changed. Things did not stop changing. She did not stop confirming. The box stayed in the drawer and the choice stayed hers, and every morning she made it, and every morning it was the same result, which was not because the result was inevitable, but because the result was what she wanted, and wanting was something she intended to keep being honest about for as long as she was capable of honesty. Kaylin never asked about the morning check, not directly. He understood why she did it, and he understood that asking would be a way of exerting influence over a practice that was specifically designed to be free of his influence, and he was not a person who confused his desire to know things with his right to know them. What he did instead was notice, in the way that people who pay attention notice things. He noticed when she came to the library on a morning that had been hard, and the work she was doing had the particular intensity of a person who has checked the drawer and confirmed the result, and is now operating from that confirmation. He noticed when the drawer was mentioned in passing, and her expression had a quality that was not quite pride and not quite peace, but that lived between them. He did not say anything about these noticings. He simply had them, and she knew he had them, and that knowing was part of what the morning check confirmed when she did it. It confirmed, this is real. What is between us is real. The realness requires maintenance, and the maintenance is mine, and I give it freely, and the giving of it is the daily proof that the freedom is intact. The Southern Province cases concluded in the 4th year, 203 of them, documented and sealed and formally closed, with the legal status of the subjects corrected, and their histories entered into the permanent Crown record. Seraphine put the final file on Kaylin's desk on a Wednesday morning, and he read it and set it down and looked at her. 203, he said. Yes, she said. 615 in total, he said, including the Northern Kingdom cases. 615, she confirmed, and the treaty territory ongoing process which is still active. How many in the treaty territory? Approximately 300 more before we reach the end of the documented cases, she said. There will be more that aren't yet documented. The intake numbers suggest we're at about 60% of the actual total. He was quiet for a moment. 40% we haven't reached yet, he said. Yes, she said, the framework needs to reach them. The formal channel needs to be visible enough that people who don't know about it yet find it. What do you need? The public notice expansion we discussed last month, she said, and the regional coordinator positions in the 3 treaty districts where the intake is lowest, and the training program expansion that Dara has been developing for the associate practitioners. All 3 are approved, he said. I signed the authorizations this morning. She looked at him before I came in. You were going to ask for them, he said. I read Dara's training proposal last week. It's good. It's very good, Seraphine said. She's better at training practitioners than I am. She explains things more clearly. You explain things very clearly, he said. I explain them precisely, she said. Dara explains them in a way that is both precise and accessible, which is a harder skill, and she has it naturally. I don't need to be the best at everything. I need to identify who is best and let them do it. He looked at her. In 4 years, he said, you've built something that doesn't require you to be at the center of it anymore. Yes, she said, that was the plan. The plan from the beginning. The plan from the 3rd year of my practice, she said. The 1st year I was trying to survive. The 2nd year I was trying to build methodology. The 3rd year I understood that the only thing that would make the work durable was if it could exist without me. So I started building it that way. And the decree, he said, was that part of the plan? She looked at him. The decree was what made the plan possible, she said. Everything I was doing before the decree was temporary. It could have been dismantled at any point. The decree made it permanent. He was quiet. You made it permanent, she said. We made it permanent, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up the Southern Province file from his desk, because it needed to be properly filed rather than leaving it sitting on his desk, and she tucked it under her arm and went to the door. Library tonight, she said. 8 o'clock, he said. 8 o'clock, she confirmed. I have a proposal for the next treaty extension. I left it on your desk this morning. I saw it, he said. 22 pages. 23, she said. The appendix is 4 pages. I'll read it tonight, he said. Yes, she said, you will. She went. The corridor was warm and the morning was fully arrived, and the palace was doing its morning things around her. The staff moving through their routines, the sounds of a building in use, the specific quality of a place that had become as familiar as any place she had ever been. She went to her office. She opened the first case file of the day. She went to work. In the top drawer of her desk, the locked box was where it always was. She had already checked this morning. The result was what it always was. She picked up her pen. The Court Gazette would note, in a brief and formal announcement issued 3 months later, that the Alpha King of the Northern Wolf Kingdom had formally indicated his intended mate. The announcement was 14 words long and provided no additional detail. Seraphine read it in the Eastern Territory, where she was on the 3rd week of what had become a 4-week stay. She read it over breakfast. She set it down. She picked it up and read it again. She wrote him a letter that evening that was not official correspondence. It was the other kind. It was 7 pages long and it said many things, including a sentence near the end that said, I checked the box this morning. You know what that means. She sent it. 3 days later a letter arrived. It was Kalen's handwriting, the clean, hard handwriting of a man who wrote exactly what he meant. It said, I know what it means. Come home when the cases are done, not before. She read it 3 times. She smiled. She put it in her bag where she was keeping the other letters, the ones that had arrived over the 4 weeks, one every few days, always specific and precise, and containing one sentence somewhere inside them that was not about the work. She went back to the case file. She was on the 51st case of the Eastern Territory series. The documentation was complex in a way she was beginning to enjoy, the specific complexity of a region whose bond traditions had developed differently from the northern kingdoms, and whose legal framework for addressing them had not yet been built, and was therefore something she was building in real time, case by case, the way she had built everything else. Case 51. A woman in her 30s who had been in a bond for 7 years. The circumstances were specific and the documentation was thorough, and the woman had come to the formal intake with the specific posture of someone who has decided to do something that matters and is doing it. Seraphine opened the file. She began. In the drawer of her traveling desk, the locked box was where it always was. She had checked it this morning. She would check it tomorrow morning. The choice was hers, and she made it, and she was going to keep making it every morning for as long as there were mornings, which she intended to be a very long time. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.